You've been carrying too much for too long, old pain, hidden anger, that quiet sadness you never talk about. They told you to just move on, to stay positive, to let it go, but no one told you how. So you smile in public, but feel heavy in private. You're tired of pretending, tired of the racing thoughts, tired of waking up with that same tight feeling in your chest. But what if I told you, you don't have to stay stuck? That deep peace, the kind that softens your soul and resets your heart, it's not a myth. It's not just for monks in mountains. It's real, and it's closer than you think. Buddhist wisdom isn't about religion or rules. It's about freedom from fear, from chaos, from emotional pain. For thousands of years, these teachings have helped people quiet their minds, heal their hearts, and come home to themselves. And now they're here for you. Tonight, as you listen to these peaceful teachings, something inside you will start to shift. Your thoughts will slow down. The weight you've been carrying will start to melt. You'll feel still, clear, free. This isn't just another calming background noise. This is your emotional reset. 3 hours of ancient wisdom, spoken straight to your soul, not to escape life, but to finally live it, fully, gently, deeply. Are you ready to come home to yourself? Let's begin. You've heard the noise for so long, you stopped noticing it. The mental noise, the emotional static, the endless inner commentary whispering what you should have said, what you should have done, what they might be thinking. You scroll, you click, you fill every second and still feel restless, still feel like something's missing. Not more content, not more input, but space, stillness, silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that heals, that holds you, that helps you breathe again. Silence isn't empty, it's full of answers. And the ancient Buddhists knew this long before science ever caught up. They called it mauna. Not just the absence of speech, but the presence of presence. Spiritual silence. The kind that doesn't just quiet the mouth, but quiets the storm inside. A silence that doesn't suppress emotion, but helps it unfold and dissolve, like ink fading into water. The world teaches us to speak louder to be heard, but Mauna teaches us the opposite, to be so inwardly still, so aware, that we no longer need to speak to be understood. And when practiced fully, Mauna becomes more than a break from talking. It becomes medicine for the nervous system, for the heart, for the parts of you that words can't touch. In Buddhist monasteries, silence isn't punishment, it's sanctuary. It resets the nervous system by shifting your attention from reaction to observation, from noise to nuance. When the mouth stops moving, body starts whispering. Your shoulders reveal the stress they've been holding. Your chest shows how long it, 39's, been constricted. Your jaw tells you how often you clench it when no one, 39's, looking. What you begin to feel once the external world goes quiet is the internal one waking up. Silence trains you to see what's really going on, not just outside, but inside. Thoughts become clearer, not because they stop, but because they no longer tangle. They start to float, and in that float you can watch them without grabbing onto them. You start to notice patterns, the ones that always lead to anxiety, the ones that always spiral into guilt. And with time, you stop feeding them. You stop reacting to every thought like it's the truth. You start observing like a witness rather than jumping in as the actor. This shift, this step back is subtle, but it changes everything. Silence also resets emotional clarity. Emotions are waves, but most people interrupt the wave halfway. We talk over it, think through it, distract ourselves, suppress it. But when you stop and stay in silence, the emotion completes its cycle. It rises, it peaks, and it falls, without needing to be fixed, just felt. This emotional resolution, letting the wave, finishes what most of us are starving for, but it can't happen when we're always jumping from one input to the next. Silence gives you the space to actually feel, not just react, and feeling fully is how you heal fully. There's also a deeper layer, one most people don't even know they're missing. When you stay in silence long enough, something else starts to rise. Beneath the pain, beneath the stories, beneath the emotional dust, you find clarity. Not dramatic insight, but simple knowing. A sense that you've always known the truth. You just couldn't hear it over the noise. That's the gift of spiritual silence. It doesn't give you something new. It helps you remember what's always been there. Like a pond that settles after being stirred, your mind begins to reflect things clearly, without distortion. You start making decisions from calm, speaking from truth, showing up with less fear, less defense, less of the mask. Silence teaches you not to fear your own mind. In a world where every pause is filled and every emotion is labeled, that's radical. There's a reason monks spend days, even years, in silence, not to escape the world, but to become fluent in it, to see it without filters, to feel it without confusion. Silence sharpens perception. You begin to hear the tone behind the words, sense the emotion behind the behavior. You become a better listener, not just to others, but to yourself. You start catching the micro shifts, the moment before your anger rises, the flash of fear before the lie, the sadness behind the smile. These are the things that silence reveals, and once seen, they can be softened, redirected, healed. When the nervous system calms, the body starts healing too. Chronic tension begins to unwind. Muscles release, breathing deepens, cortisol lowers, heart rate balances. You move from survival mode to safety, from defense to openness, from hiding to showing up. And here's the part people forget. Silence isn't passive, it's active surrender. It takes courage to stop speaking, to stop explaining, to stop performing. It takes even more courage to listen to what comes up when you do. But if you stay with it, it gives you back something the world can't. Inner authority. The kind of inner authority that no compliment can boost and no insult can shake. And slowly, your relationships change too. You stop talking just to fill space. You become more intentional, more present. You speak when it matters and listen when it doesn't. You give others the gift of space. You stop jumping in to fix. You stop needing to control. That quiet confidence becomes magnetic. People feel safer around you not because you say the right things, but because your energy speaks louder than your words ever could. There's also an energy cost most of us don't realize we're paying until we stop. Talking burns energy. Constant expression, especially emotional expression without clarity, drains the nervous system. But silence restores it. Like plugging back into a deeper source, you feel nourished, not from outside. Validation, but from within. This is why silence is part of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, not just as a lifestyle, but as liberation. Right speech begins with right silence. When you know the weight of words, you start using them like medicine, not weapons. You speak less, but mean more. And when you fall silent, it's not emptiness, it's wisdom. Silence also shows you how noisy your mind really is. And that's not a failure, it's the beginning. Once you see the noise, you stop identifying with it. You stop believing every thought is you. Instead, you see them as visitors. They come, they stay, they leave. You don't have to invite them in for tea. This shift, this inner detachment, creates emotional clarity like nothing else. Suddenly, you don't spiral over every fear. You don't chase every craving. You sit, you breathe, you feel, and you let it pass. That's what healing looks like. Silence teaches you that urgency is often false. That you don't have to answer every message, solve every problem, prove your worth. That it's okay to be still, to not have an opinion, to not explain your pain. In fact, some wounds don't need to be spoken about. They just need to be held. And silence is the most honest way to hold something sacred. Not everything is meant to be shared. Some truths become diluted when turned into words, and some clarity only arises when you stop searching and start listening to the space between thoughts. That's where intuition lives. That's where wisdom rests. And over time, you start trusting yourself more, not because someone told you to, but because in silence, you heard yourself clearly. You felt your truth without the pressure to make it pretty. You no longer need to overthink your choices. You start recognizing what feels heavy and what feels light, what aligns and what doesn't. And that kind of knowing silent, rooted, wordless is what people spend lifetimes looking for. We live in a culture that rewards noise. Noise in productivity, noise in self-promotion, noise in opinions. But peace doesn't live there. Peace isn't something you win, it's something you return to, and mourner is the path back. You might start with just 5 minutes a day. No talking, no music, no phone, just presence. At first, it might feel uncomfortable. Your thoughts might get louder before they quiet down. That's okay. That's normal. Don't run. Stay. Let the stillness do its work. Because the truth is, silence isn't silent at all. It speaks, it teaches, it heals. It tells you what your body has been trying to say for years. That you're tired. That you're carrying too much. That it's time to let go. It shows you that clarity doesn't always come from thinking harder, but from thinking less, from making space, from softening the grip. And somewhere in that space, you find your center again. Not the version of you shaped by fear or urgency or expectation, but the version that's always been there. Calm, clear, kind, awake. This is why silence isn't just peaceful, it's powerful. It's where you meet yourself without distortion, where you dissolve old patterns without force, where you step out of the storm without needing to outrun it. When practiced with intention, mauna is not just a break from speaking, it's a reunion with your own wisdom, with your own peace, with a self that doesn't need approval to feel whole. And slowly, your life begins to change, not through effort, but through alignment. You start surrounding yourself with people who respect your quiet. You seek experiences that feed your spirit, not your ego. You stop needing to prove anything and just live, fully, softly, truthfully. Silence becomes your sanctuary, your medicine, your teacher, and one day, without even noticing, you'll wake up feeling lighter, not because life got easier, but because you stopped carrying so much noise. You started trusting the voice that doesn't speak, the one that's always known the way home. And now you, 39, re-listening. And just like that, silence brings you back to yourself. Not in theory, but in presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need fixing, changing, or explaining. The kind that sees clearly, breathes fully, and accepts reality as it is. But there's something else waiting under that quiet. Something most people avoid without realizing. Pain. Not loud pain, not dramatic pain, deeper pain. The one you carry quietly, the one that hides beneath your strength. The ache of what you've lost, the weight of what never healed. The emotions you buried to survive. And this is where the real work begins. Because silence doesn't erase suffering, it brings it into focus. But Buddhism doesn't ask you to run from it. It invites you to face it. And not just face it, but transform it. That's the alchemy. The ancient, sacred turning of something heavy into something healing. Dukkha is the word. Emotional pain, discomfort, dissatisfaction. It's not just grief or trauma. It's that subtle sense of unrest. The tightness in the chest when things go wrong. The low hum of longing when something's missing. The quiet frustration when life doesn't match the picture in your mind. Most people try to escape dukkha through distraction, through denial, through trying to fix everything outside themselves. But Buddhism flips the script. It teaches that suffering isn't a mistake. It's a messenger. And if you listen to it, really listen, it becomes your teacher, not to punish you, but to guide you. Every emotional wound holds the seeds of wisdom, but only if you stop trying to get rid of it, long enough to hear what it's trying to say. Transformation doesn't begin when the pain stops. It begins when you stop resisting it, when you stop treating sadness like a problem, when you stop treating grief like a weakness, when you stop trying to numb anger and start understanding it instead. Pain doesn't want to hurt you. It wants to show you where you're not aligned, where you've abandoned yourself, where you still need to heal. And once you understand this, your relationship with suffering changes. You stop seeing it as a failure. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What is this here to teach me?" That shift is everything. Because now, instead of hiding from your wounds, you start working with them. You stop blaming the protease wounds world for what you feel. You begin to see that every emotional trigger is a doorway, a chance to meet a part of yourself that's still waiting for your attention. Dukkha becomes a path, a practice, a portal. Through the lens of Buddhist teachings, suffering isn't about punishment or karma catching up to you. It's about friction, the friction between what ice and what your mind insists should be. That friction causes pain, but the pain points you to where you, 39, still clinging to control, clinging to perfection, clinging to the past. And that's where the alchemy starts. You bring awareness into the exact place where you want to run. You turn toward what hurts without trying to fix it. You hold the fear. You sit with the shame. You allow the anger to breathe, and in that honest space, something shifts. Compassion rises, not as a concept, but as a force. Real compassion isn't about being nice. It's about seeing clearly. And when you see your pain without judgment, you start seeing everyone else's pain differently too. You stop reacting to people's outbursts. You begin to recognize that their cruelty is often a mask for their own wounds, that their coldness comes from their own freezing inside, that their walls are the result of their own broken trust. This kind of seeing gives you power. Not power over others, but power to respond from love instead of fear. to stay grounded when others are reactive, to hold space instead of lashing out. Because you've met your own darkness, you've walked through it, you've made peace with it. And that journey builds a strength nothing outside you can touch. This is what the Buddha meant by liberation, not the end of hardship, but the end of being controlled by it. The freedom to feel everything without being consumed by it. The power to use suffering as fuel, not as chains. Because when you stop fighting your pain, it starts guiding you. It softens you. It teaches you empathy, not just for others, but for the parts of yourself you used to reject. And this is important because you can't fully love others until you've stopped hating parts of yourself. You can't offer deep compassion if you're still shaming your own sadness. But when you hold your emotional pain with patience, with care, it changes texture. The sharpness softens, the heat cools. What once felt unbearable becomes understandable, and what's understandable becomes transformable. This is emotional transmutation, taking the raw energy of pain and giving it new direction. Like fire that used to burn now becoming light, like a wound that used to define you becoming a scar that teaches. The hurt doesn't disappear, but it doesn't hurt in the same way. It becomes part of your wholeness, not something you hide, but something you honor. And with time, you start trusting this process. You stop fearing hard emotions. You stop reacting to discomfort with panic. You begin to see sadness as a sign of depth, anger as a signal for boundaries, anxiety as a messenger for unmet needs. You stop labeling emotions as good or bad. You start listening. Instead, listening for what each one is trying to protect, what each one is trying to heal. That's the compassion inside dukkha. It reveals what matters to you. You wouldn't grieve if you didn't love. You wouldn't get angry if you didn't care. You wouldn't feel anxious if you didn't crave safety. Pain doesn't make you broken. It makes you human, and being human is sacred. In Buddhist practice, this transformation is not forced. It's allowed. You don't rush the pain. You don't bypass it. You give it space. You let it unfold in its own rhythm. You sit with it the way a monk sits with breath, gently, consistently, with patience. And in that stillness, healing happens. Not always quickly, not always visibly, but deeply, quietly, steadily. And eventually, you begin to notice the shifts. You don't react to criticism like you used to. You don't spiral when plans fall apart. You don't carry resentment for days. It's not that you feel less, it's that you've built capacity to hold what you feel. Your nervous system becomes more resilient. Your mind becomes clearer. Your heart becomes stronger. And this changes how you show up in the world. You become less defensive, more present, less focused on fixing others, and more focused on understanding them. You stop needing people to behave a certain way in order for you to feel okay. You stop tying your worth to things you can't control. That's real freedom. And it starts with embracing your own suffering as sacred material. The Buddha didn't promise a life without dukkha. He promised a path through it. And this path isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. Sometimes you revisit old pain. Sometimes it flares up. But each time you meet it with more awareness, more skill, more compassion. And with each return, you suffer less, because you're no longer resisting it. This is the heart of Buddhist transmutation, turning reaction into reflection, turning contraction into expansion, turning suffering into strength, not the rigid kind, but the kind that holds both joy and sorrow without crumbling. And here's the truth most people miss. The deeper you go into your pain, the more capacity you have for joy, real joy, not the surface kind, but the kind that doesn't need circumstances to be perfect, the kind that flows from presence, from connection, from peace with your own heart. This isn't just emotional maturity, it's spiritual evolution, and you don't need to retreat to a monastery to find it. You find it in daily life, in the pauses between arguments, in the stillness after crying, in the pauses choice to stay with your discomfort instead of running from it. That's where the gold is. That's the alchemy. The world may keep telling you to just be happy, to avoid pain, to stay positive no matter what. But Buddhist wisdom whispers something more honest, more human. Feel everything. Let it teach you. And then let it go. That's how you rise. Not by avoiding the fire, but by walking through it with grace. And eventually, you become a source of light for others, not because you have all the answers, but because you're no longer afraid of the darkness. You become someone who can hold space for pain without rushing to fix it. Someone who can sit with discomfort without turning away. Someone who loves from depth, not from fear. And this is how emotional pain becomes compassionate power. Not power over people, but power to meet them exactly where they are. Power to forgive without forgetting. Power to speak with clarity and act with wisdom. Power to be soft without collapsing, strong without hardening, steady without becoming numb. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens choice by choice, breath by breath. Every time you choose to feel instead of flee. Every time you meet yourself with kindness instead of judgment. Every time you pause and say, "This too belongs." That's the quiet revolution of Buddhist alchemy. It doesn't shout, it doesn't sparkle, but it changes everything. And now your journey continues. Deeper, wiser, braver, not away from suffering, but through it, and through it into freedom. When you stop resisting your pain and begin listening to it, you learn that your suffering is not a sign of weakness, it's a doorway to strength. But there's still one question left hanging quietly in the air, a deeper layer beneath all the emotion, beneath even the compassion you've started to cultivate. Who is it that's suffering? Who is this you who carries the grief, who holds the anger, who fears rejection or clings to praise? That question, left unasked, is the root of nearly all emotional pain. And the moment you dare to look at it clearly, everything starts to shift. What if the version of you that suffers the most, the one that feels broken, betrayed, inadequate, is not the real you, not a lie, but not solid either, just a temporary construction made of memories, habits, opinions, and stories passed down like heirlooms? The teaching of anatta, or non-self, breaks the illusion that this identity you carry is a fixed, unchanging truth. In reality, it's a flowing process, not a thing, a verb, not a noun. Most emotional suffering arises when we grip tightly to a sense of me, my story, my failure, my worth, my wound. But the more we hold on to this self-image, the more fragile and defensive we become. We build an identity out of old pain and then live our lives protecting it. Every insult cuts deeper, every loss feels personal, every mistake becomes shame, not simply feedback. And yet, when you begin to loosen that grip, not by erasing your humanity, but by questioning your assumptions, something opens. A kind of emotional spaciousness begins to form. You start to see that the self you defend so fiercely is always changing. The thoughts you believed yesterday are different from today. The emotions that seemed permanent last year have already faded. The preferences, the desires, the fears all shifting. If the self keeps changing, how can it be fixed? If the self is a process, not a possession, why are we so afraid to let it go? This is the heart of anatta. It's not saying you don't exist. It's saying you don't exist the way you think. You do. And this realization, when embodied, is deeply freeing, because once you stop treating identity as a solid object, you stop taking every emotional wound as a permanent scar. You start seeing emotions not as attacks on who you are, but as waves moving through the open field of awareness. There's pain, but there's no one fixed in that pain. There's anger, but there's no fixed self that is angry forever. This changes your relationship with emotional triggers. Someone criticizes you, and the old pattern of defense starts to rise. But now, you notice it. You don't immediately grab onto the thought, "They're attacking me." You start to observe there's a sensation of defensiveness. That shift from identification to observation creates space. Space for response, space for reflection, space for peace. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It's clarity. You begin to see your thoughts as clouds passing through the sky, not as truths carved in stone. You notice how certain beliefs about yourself trigger anxiety, while others bring temporary relief. You see how often you replay stories of failure or unworthiness, and slowly you begin to ask, if I am not these stories, who am I? That's where the liberation begins. Because when you stop defining yourself by the stories of your past, you stop carrying their emotional weight. You don't forget your experiences, but you stop living through them. You let go of the need to keep proving or defending a version of yourself. You start resting in what's real right now, this moment, this breath, this awareness. And from here, something profound starts to unfold. When the fixation on me softens, compassion for others grows naturally. Why? Because when you see that your pain wasn't personal, you begin to see that other people's actions aren't personal either. The person who yelled at you wasn't attacking you, they were reacting from their own conditioning. The betrayal you felt wasn't because you're unworthy, it was because someone else was lost in their own pain. This shift dismantles resentment, not because you excuse harmful behavior, but because you no longer build your identity around the wound. You begin to understand that most emotional harm doesn't come from others alone, it comes from how tightly we cling to the belief, this happened to me, therefore I am this kind of person. Once that belief loosens, healing flows. The illusion of a solid self also creates fear of change. We cling to labels because they make us feel secure. But the truth is, identity becomes a prison when we refuse to evolve. Anatta opens the door to Demo to N. Fluidity. You stop needing to be consistent in a rigid way. You allow yourself to grow, to contradict, to outgrow patterns that once defined you. And that adaptability is a form of emotional resilience. You no longer panic when old feelings rise. You no longer shrink under the weight of shame. You know, these states aren't permanent. They're weather, not architecture. They pass. And in that passing, you return to a deeper home, not the self you constructed, but the awareness that holds it all. And what is that awareness? In Buddhism, it is not a self in disguise. It is clarity, presence, a knowing that doesn't cling, a seeing that doesn't grab. And from that place, you respond to life with greater gentleness. You don't have to harden when you're misunderstood. You don't have to inflate when you're praised. You stay centered, Not because you're avoiding emotion, but because you're no longer identified with every thought and feeling that arises. This kind of inner stability leads to deep emotional freedom. When you're no longer entangled with a fixed identity, life becomes lighter. You can laugh at your mistakes. You can cry without shame. You can express yourself without fear of contradiction. There's a natural honesty that emerges when you don't need to be anyone in particular. Relationships begin to transform as well. You stop needing others to reflect back a certain image of you. You listen more. You defend less. You become curious instead of controlling. Because when your identity isn't on the line, you're free to be present. You can hold space for difference. You can forgive more easily because your ego isn't absorbing every slight like an open wound. And this has a ripple effect. Your calm becomes a mirror. Your openness becomes an invitation. You stop feeding conflict with reactivity. You start disarming tension with presence, and not by force, but by resting in the simplicity of being. The less you carry the burden of identity, the more energy you have to care, to serve, to love. This understanding also breaks the cycle of seeking. So much suffering comes from trying to become someone better, more successful, more liked, more spiritual. But when you see through the breeze, illusion of a fixed self, you stop chasing versions of yourself that don't exist. You start living from presence instead of performance. And presence brings peace. You're not trying to fix every flaw. You're not constantly adjusting your mask. You're just here, aware, alive. And in that presence, joy arises. Not the kind that depends on circumstances, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from not needing anything extra to feel complete. This is not about erasing personality or becoming passive. It's about seeing that your personality is a fluid expression, not a fixed identity. It's about knowing that who you are is not limited to your thoughts or history. And when you stop believing that you are your pain, your past, your labels, you step into a new kind of freedom without edges. This shift also allows for emotional healing on a subtle level. Often, emotional wounds stay stuck because they're tied to identity. I'm someone who always gets abandoned. I'm someone who's never enough. These identities trap the pain. But when you question the identity, the wound has room to move. You can still feel grief, but it doesn't define you. You can still face fear, but it doesn't shape your self-worth. You begin to live from awareness, not from history. And awareness doesn't need a story to exist. It just is. And that just is-ness becomes your ground, stable, clear, open. This is the liberation anatta offers, not through force or denial, but through understanding. A gentle undoing of everything that keeps you bound. A return to what's always been here, the awareness. Underneath every experience, the presence that holds every emotion, the stillness beneath every movement. When you live from that place, emotions still arise, but they flow through you, not into you. They don't stick, they don't define, they visit and they leave, and in between you rest in something quiet, something whole. That is emotional liberation, not the end of feeling, but the end of being held hostage by the idea of who you think you are. And in that letting go, you find something more real than identity. You find peace. And not the kind that needs to be earned, but the kind that was always yours. All you had to do was stop gripping the illusion long enough to feel it. When identity softens, clarity enters. No longer chained to labels or past stories, the mind begins to notice what was always there, but rarely seen. The subtle energies flowing beneath thought. not the loud narratives or emotional outbursts, but the quiet tones, the textures, the flavors of the mind itself. And these flavors matter because they shape how we feel, how we act, and ultimately who we become. Some thoughts build peace, others quietly poison it. The difference is rarely obvious. That's why so many fall into suffering without knowing why. The Buddha offered a map, not just to understand thought, but to feel its moral weight, its energy, its consequence. He called it kusala and akusala, two paths, two qualities. One leads to clarity, the other to confusion. One opens the heart, the other clouds it. This isn't about morality in the way we usually think of it. It's about alignment, mental hygiene, emotional integrity. Kusala refers to thoughts, intentions, and actions that are skillful, meaning they come from a place of wisdom, balance, and compassion. They lead to well-being, not just for others, but for you. They uplift the mind. They don't leave a bitter residue. Akusala, by contrast, refers to unskillful states, not bad in a moral sense, but unwholesome, rooted in greed, hatred, or delusion. These thoughts may feel powerful in the moment, justified, righteous, seductive, but they always leave you more tangled, more reactive, more drained. To see this clearly is to take full emotional responsibility for the state of your inner world. Not blame, not guilt, just honest noticing. When you begin to watch your mind this way, you stop reacting to life automatically. You learn to pause, to assess not just the content of your thoughts, but their quality, their scent, their direction. A thought about your future may seem logical, but is it coming from grounded care or anxious control? A comment you want to make may be true, but is it rooted in kindness or in the need to win? A choice you're about to make may seem harmless, but is it echoing fear or love? This level of self-inquiry takes practice. It's not about overanalyzing every mental event. It's about tuning in, feeling the energy of a thought, the way you feel the atmosphere of a room. Some thoughts expand your breath, others contract it. Some thoughts bring your shoulders down, others raise your heart rate. The body often knows before the intellect does. Skillful mental states, those that lead toward kusalakari calm, they create inner space. They feel complete even before any action is taken. There is a sense of rightness that doesn't need validation. You feel connected to truth, to care, to balance. These thoughts don't escalate emotional pain. They help integrate it. They don't spike judgment. They invite understanding. Unskillful states, akusala, tend to rush. They have a pushing quality, a pressure behind them. They often come dressed as urgency, masked as logic, wrapped in emotional reactivity. But underneath there is disconnection, a pulling away from clarity. These thoughts spiral, they loop, they convince you of danger when none exists. And worst of all, they feel familiar, because they've been rehearsed for years. This is why training the mind to distinguish the two is so essential. Without this discernment, we act out of habit. We speak from wounds. We respond from fear. We create stories that harm our peace. But when we build the habit of noticing not just what we're thinking, but how those thoughts feel in the nervous system, everything changes. This is not a rejection of hard feelings. It's a refinement of awareness. Acknowledging anger is healthy. Feeding it with narratives that inflame it is not. Feeling grief is human. Letting it collapse your sense of worth is unskillful. The goal is not to become perfect or robotic. it's to become discerning, to know when you're moving from love and when you're moving from lack. The Buddha taught that every moment is a fork in the road, every thought is a seed. It will either bloom into more confusion or into more peace. And often, the difference is subtle. A thought of wanting to help can be skillfuler. It can come from needing to fix in order to feel valuable. A desire to speak the truth can be skillfuler. It can come from needing to dominate. The shift is not always in the action, but in the energy behind it. That energy becomes easier to feel the more present you are. That's why mindfulness matters, not just to reduce stress, but to become intimate with your own inner life. The more you sit with the breath, the more you notice the push and pull of your thoughts. The more you catch the moment a craving forms. The more you sense the contraction when judgment arises. And in that awareness, you have choice. Choice is power. The power to pause. The power to question. The power to not follow every thought that knocks on your door. That's emotional hygiene. And like physical hygiene, it's not a one-time event. It's a daily tending, a quiet discipline of checking in with your mental state before you let it spill into speech or action. This practice builds emotional maturity. You stop being a slave to your moods. You stop blaming others for your reactions. You learn to trace the emotional experience back to its root, often a small, unnoticed thought that was never questioned. You begin to take full ownership of your inner state, without shame, without denial. And from this foundation, you grow compassion, not as a forced virtue, but as a natural result of clarity. Because when you recognize how often your own mind wanders into unskillful states, you become less reactive when others do too. You stop expecting perfection. You start seeing the shared struggle, the shared messiness. And you respond not with enabling, but with presence. This also frees you from false confidence, because even thoughts that sound wise can be unskillful if they feed the ego. Even spiritual insights can become ego traps if they aren't rooted in humility. Kusala is not about appearing good. It's about moving in harmony with what uplifts and supports clarity. It's not performative, it's embodied. And this discernment becomes your inner compass. You no longer need to ask others constantly what's right. You feel it. You sense when something is aligned or not. Not based on fear of consequences, but based on energetic integrity. You start trusting your inner knowing, not because it always tells you what you want, but because it tells you what brings real peace. This is where discipline meets freedom, because the more you commit to choosing skillful states, the more spacious your inner world becomes. You're no longer dragged by every passing mood. You're no longer hijacked by every thought. You hold yourself with steadiness, with clarity, with care. And over time, your default settings begin to shift. The grooves of the mind change. The thoughts that used to dominate begin to fade. The reactions that once felt automatic slow down. You find yourself choosing kindness more often, not out of effort, but out of ease. You speak more truth, not because you should, but because it feels clean. That's the power of mental training. It reconditions the mind, not through suppression, but through redirection. Not through force, but through awareness. You meet each thought with a quiet question. Is this skillful? Does this support peace? Does this align with my deepest values? This inquiry doesn't turn you into a moralist. It turns you into someone who respects their inner world. Someone who cares enough about their own well-being to not feed the thoughts that erode it. Someone who begins to see thoughts not as facts, but as suggestions, and not all suggestions are helpful. The mind, untrained, is wild, but the mind, observed, becomes a source of wisdom. When you pay attention, you learn what nourishes you and what drains you. You learn the difference between inspiration and impulse, between insight and insecurity, between love and attachment. And slowly, you begin to live more from kusala, not because you're chasing virtue, but because unskillful states simply lose their grip. You feel how heavy they are, how much noise they make, how little they offer, and you let them pass, not with judgment, not with fear, but with peace. This is not perfection, it's practice, a lifelong path of tending to your mind with the same care you offer a beloved child, patient, curious, compassionate. You forgive yourself when you forget. You begin again when you fall. And with each return, you strengthen the muscle of discernment. Because at the end of the day, the quality of your life is shaped by the quality of your thoughts. Not just the ones you notice, but the ones you entertain, the ones you believe, the ones you repeat. Every moment of awareness is a chance to choose skillfulness over reactivity, presence over habit, peace over drama. And it starts with one simple question, whispered in the silence between thoughts. Is this useful? Is this kind? Is this true? That's the doorway. Walk through it, and you'll find a mind that no longer drags you around but walks beside you, steady and clear. As the mind begins to quiet and you learn to recognize the texture of thoughts, something deeper begins to stir. Body speaks. It doesn't. 39. Et use words, but it never lies. While thoughts rise and pass quickly, the body holds what the mind can't process. Emotional residue lives in posture, in tension, in breath. And yet, we often overlook it. We chase clarity in silence and stillness, but forget the power of motion. That's where the next layer of awareness lives, not just in sitting, but in walking. A slow, deliberate step becomes a doorway to see your inner world from a different angle. Walking meditation is not exercise. It's not about reaching a destination or getting the heart rate up. It's a way to train attention using movement, a practice that reveals what stillness sometimes hides. When the body moves with presence, emotions surface gently. You start to notice what you carry without force, without judgment. This method is one of the most overlooked yet profound tools in Buddhist practice. It brings the mind down into the feet, into the legs, into the ground. It grounds thought. It slows down reaction. It gives rhythm to reflection. Each step becomes a mirror. You notice how your weight shifts, how your pace speeds up when you 39 anxious, how your feet drag when you 39 avoiding something, how tension pools in the hips when anger is present. These are not metaphors, they are patterns, real, lived experiences that appear through movement, and by paying attention, you begin to read them clearly. Mindful walking gives you access to a different form of intelligence, embodied insight. You are no longer just watching your thoughts from the outside. You are experiencing them as sensations, as patterns of breath and balance. And this teaches you something that stillness cannot: how to carry mindfulness into life, into motion, into the places where things aren't quiet. When you walk slowly, with full awareness, you give your nervous system time to catch up with your mind. Most people move through life too fast for their emotions to be digested. They're 5 steps ahead of their feelings. But walking meditation corrects that. It forces a slower rhythm, one where you can track your emotional weather in real time, where the act of stepping becomes a form of listening. And with that listening comes clarity. Not dramatic realization, just small, steady shifts. You might feel a tightness in the chest that wasn't 39T obvious before, a habit of clenching your jaw, a recurring thought that always appears when you cross a certain threshold. These are signals. And when you walk with attention, you're not just noticing them, you're letting them move through. The body naturally processes emotion when we stop interfering. Walking helps this. It gives the mind just enough to do so the deeper patterns can surface. You, 39, not trying to solve anything. You, 39, simply witnessing how your inner world unfolds, step by step. And in this process, something opens, emotional. Patterns that felt stuck begin to loosen. They begin to move. And over time, they begin to dissolve. What you're learning is emotional literacy, not through analysis, but through rhythm. Every footstep becomes a punctuation mark in the inner dialogue. You begin to notice how your thoughts influence your steps, how your mood shapes your posture. And with this awareness, choice returns. You can slow down when anger pushes. You can breathe when fear closes in. You can soften the body even when the heart feels hard. This is what makes walking meditation a practice of integration. It brings the insight of stillness into the world of action. It allows you to stay grounded even when things move. It trains the nervous system to regulate under motion. And this has powerful effects in daily life. When stress rises, you don't immediately react. You've trained yourself to observe. When conflict appears, you're less likely to tighten. You've learned to stay present in the body. This presence changes how you relate to emotion. You stop treating it like a threat. You start feeling it as energy, not identity. Sadness becomes something that moves through the spine, not something that defines your worth. Frustration becomes a tightening in the calves, not a sign of failure. These shifts are subtle, but over time, they create a new relationship with your emotional landscape. The body becomes your ally, not just a vehicle. It becomes a partner in awareness. You feel your weight as it shifts. You hear the sounds around you. You notice how the environment affects your inner state. A certain path might bring up old memories. A corner might tighten your breath. These cues were always there, you just weren't tuned to them. Walking meditation tunes you. It refines your instrument. It teaches you that presence is portable, that you don't need silence to be mindful, that every step can be sacred, every breath can be a reset. You begin to use walking not to get somewhere, but to return to yourself. And this return is healing, especially when emotion feels too big to sit with. Some pain is too dense to hold still, but it softens with motion. Walking creates just enough movement for the nervous system to stay open. It gives fear a way to flow out. It gives grief a rhythm to follow. It gives anger a path to unwind. These are not techniques, they're truths rooted in practice. You also begin to realize that emotion isn't static. It moves in cycles. And when you walk with awareness, you can track these cycles. You see how sadness rises, stays, and then fades. You feel how irritation pulses, then softens. This tracking creates confidence. You learn that no state lasts forever. That emotional storms, like weather, always pass if you don't hold on to them. And walking teaches you to not hold, not by suppressing, but by allowing. by letting each step carry something away, by trusting that the earth can hold what you release, that your body knows how to reset if you let it. Over time, walking meditation strengthens your resilience. You no longer fear discomfort. You meet it. You walk with it. You learn its rhythm. And in that companionship, you begin to understand something vital, that healing doesn't mean erasing pain. It means learning to move with it, to carry it without collapse, to stay open in the presence of heaviness. This doesn't make you detached. It makes you steady. You start navigating life with more grace. You become less reactive, more reflective. You don't run from discomfort. You walk through it with attention, with care, with patience. And in this practice, you find simplicity. No tools, no devices. Just your body, your breath, your presence. It's enough. It's always been enough. This is what the Buddha taught, that liberation is in this moment, in this body, in this awareness, not after a retreat, not in some distant state, but right here, step by step by step. As your feet meet the ground, your mind learns to settle, your emotions learn to move, your heart learns to listen. You're not trying to become peaceful, you're becoming peace itself, not through control but through connection. Walking meditation reconnects you to your breath, to your steps, to your emotional truth. And in that reconnection, a deep kind of healing unfolds. Quiet, gentle, real. You don't need to chase insight. You don't need to force change. You just need to walk aware, alive, present. Let the body guide. Let the mind watch. Let the heart open. This is the path. This is the mirror. This is the way you come home, one step at a time. With each step taken in presence, something deep begins to settle. The noise quiets. The stories slow down. Awareness roots itself in the body. You feel more than thoughts now. You feel movements in your inner landscape that were hidden under distractions. But not everything that rises feels peaceful. Some emotions surface with weight. Some memories return with sharpness. They don't fit into the lightness we seek, yet they return because they were never truly gone. These are the hidden forces, unseen but powerful. This is where shadow work begins. In Buddhist tradition, there is a figure that represents these hidden forces, Mara, not as a demon of myth alone, but as a psychological truth. Mara is not a villain to defeat, but a mirror of the parts of ourselves we try to avoid. Fear, desire, self-doubt, jealousies are the forms Mara takes. And when left in the dark, they grow stronger. But when seen clearly, they begin to dissolve. That's the paradox. What we fear in ourselves loses power when we meet it face to face. Shadow work in this context is not dramatic confrontation, it's honest awareness. It's not about fighting the parts of yourself that feel ugly or unwanted. It's about recognizing that those parts exist because they were never given space. The inner Mara appears most when we suppress emotion, when we pretend not to feel what we actually do, when we shame ourselves into silence instead of listening with compassion. Fear is not the enemy. Fear becomes destructive when we don't allow it to be felt. Envy isn't poison by itself. It becomes harmful when we deny it and act from the shadows. Craving isn't inherently wrong, but when we identify with it and let it control us, it leads to suffering. These are the emotional archetypes of Mara, and the path isn't about banishing them, it's about integration. Integration means no longer splitting yourself into good and bad, worthy and unworthy. It means sitting with all aspects of your experience and asking, what is this part trying to protect? Because even your most difficult emotions began as strategies for survival. Fear tried to keep you safe. Craving tried to fill a space. Anger tried to give you power when you felt powerless. Once you see that, you can hold these parts with understanding rather than judgment. This shift is crucial. Many spiritual seekers try to bypass the shadow. They aim only for light, only for peace, only for love. But in doing so, they exile the very parts of themselves that need the most care. The shadow doesn't disappear because you meditate more. It waits. And when life shakes you, it returns, louder. But if you turn toward it, if you look with clear eyes and a soft heart, it begins to transform. Meeting the shadow doesn't mean indulging it. It means allowing it to be seen. When envy rises, can you acknowledge it without shame? Can you feel its burn without acting on it? That simple pause is powerful. That moment of clarity is the beginning of healing. You start to trace the root. Maybe it comes from feeling overlooked, from believing there's not enough, from forgetting your own worth. Once seen, you don't need to be ruled by it. Craving works the same way. The pull to have more, be more, get more. It doesn't need punishment. It needs attention. What are you avoiding when you reach for more? What emptiness are you trying to fill? Often, it's not about the thing itself. It's about a deeper longing for comfort, for connection, for meaning. When you sit with the craving and explore its layers, you no longer follow it blindly. You begin to respond rather than react. Fear is another mask Mara wears, and it is often the most persuasive. Fear tells stories that feel true. It paints futures that haven't happened. It tightens the breath and narrows the view. But fear isn't a problem until we let it define our choices. When we meet fear as a visitor rather than a voice of truth, we soften its hold. We ask, what is this fear pointing to? What wound has not been healed? What risk feels too big? In Buddhist teachings, even the Buddha was visited by Mara, not once, but many times, even after enlightenment. The point wasn't to destroy Mara, but to recognize him, to say, I see you, to sit with the discomfort without turning away. That's the teaching. Enlightenment doesn't erase difficulty, it changes how we relate to it. So in your own life, the question becomes, where does Mara visit you? In which moments do you feel the urge to hide, to perform, to control? These are the doorways to shadow work. These are the places where honesty becomes liberation. You're not looking for flaws to fix. You're building the capacity to hold what's true, even when it's hard. This work also brings humility. It shows you that no emotion is beneath you, that no thought defines you, that you are more than your best and your worst days, and that truth creates space for others. When you stop rejecting your own humanity, you stop demanding perfection from the people around you. You listen better. You judge less. You become a safe space for yourself and for others. That safety is healing, because much of the shadow was born in environments where emotion wasn't safe, where anger had to be hidden, where sadness was shamed, where vulnerability was punished. When you create a space now where all of you is welcome, you break the pattern. You stop passing the wound forward. You start writing a new story, one where truth is not a threat. Shadow work also strengthens your intuition, because once the noise of suppressed emotion quiets, you begin to hear your deeper knowing. You sense when something is off. You notice when you're acting from fear rather than wisdom. You recognize when old patterns are resurfacing. This awareness becomes your guide, not to avoid difficulty, but to move through it with clarity. And this movement brings energy back. Suppressing emotion is exhausting. Pretending to be someone, you, 39, not drains the spirit. When you reclaim those lost parts, when you bring them out of the shadow, you feel more whole, more alive. Not because life got easier, but because you stopped hiding from it. You also begin to feel compassion in new ways, not just as a concept, but as a lived experience. You know what it's like to struggle with jealousy, to be afraid, to crave validation, and that knowing helps. You see others more gently. You no longer react to their masks. You recognize their pain beneath the surface, and that recognition is healing for both of you. The work doesn't end. Mara returns, sometimes in familiar forms, sometimes wearing new faces. But now you know the signs. You feel the contraction. You hear the story. And instead of collapsing into it, you pause, you acknowledge, you breathe, you let it pass. And if it doesn't pass quickly, you stay. You hold yourself through it, not with force, not with blame, but with patience. Because this is the path, not escape, not perfection, but presence, deep, unwavering. Presence with whatever arises. You don't need to fix your shadow, you need to know it. You need to see it clearly enough that it doesn't need to shout. When you stop making parts of yourself wrong, those parts stop sabotaging you. They become integrated, aligned. They give their energy back to the whole. That's the promise of this path, not that you'll never feel fear again, but that fear will no longer shape your identity. Not that craving disappears, but that it no longer leads your choices. Not that you never feel envy, but that it no longer blocks your joy. You move with these parts, not against them. And in that movement, you grow, not away from yourself, but deeper into yourself, into a version of you that is honest, aware, and whole. This is the liberation found in darkness, not from ignoring it, but from lighting a candle and sitting with it until the monsters become messengers. That's how you befriend the inner Mara, not through rejection, through recognition, through love, fierce enough to hold what hurts, through wisdom steady enough to see clearly, through presence deep enough to heal, and step by step, moment by moment, shadow becomes light, not because it changed, but because you did. When you stop rejecting your inner darkness and begin holding it with presence, something profound begins to shift. You no longer run from discomfort, you learn to meet it. You understand that the parts of you once tried to silence were never your enemies, they were guides. But even with this insight, there is a deeper layer that continues to surface, a pattern that seems to repeat. You notice how the same emotional pain keeps returning. Different people, different situations, but the same inner loop. You heal, and then you find yourself back in the same struggle, not because you failed, but because something deeper is trying to reveal itself. This is where the wisdom of samsara becomes essential, not as a doctrine of literal rebirth, but as a psychological and emotional map. Samsara is the cycle of birth and death, of rising and falling, of becoming and unraveling. In Buddhist teachings, it represents the wheel of suffering-endless repetition, driven by craving, aversion, and ignorance. But on a personal level, it points to the patterns that govern our emotional lives, the loops we find ourselves trapped in again and again, without realizing how or why. Each time you react to pain with the same story, each time you chase validation through the same role, Each time you fall into the same argument or fear or habit, you're experiencing a personal version of samsara. It's not just about what happens outside. It's about how you keep giving birth to the same experience internally, even after the outer conditions have changed. And until you recognize the cycle, you remain inside it, believing it. 39. Life when it's really just repetition. Awareness is what interrupts the loop. Not dramatic insight, but slow, steady seeing. You begin to trace the moments before the emotion peaks. You notice the sensation before the thought forms. You become sensitive to how your inner world reacts before your outer world does. And in that gap, you find choice. You're no longer spinning unconsciously, you're witnessing the pattern with clarity. This witnessing is not passive, it's the beginning of transformation. When you see how often your mind recreates the same reality, you begin to ask different questions. Not, how do I fix this? But, what is fueling this? The answer is often subtle. A belief formed in childhood, a fear of being abandoned, a need to feel significant. These emotional roots power the wheel of samsara, and once seen clearly, they begin to lose their grip. You start to understand how craving drives you into cycles. Not just material craving, but emotional craving, the desire to feel loved, needed, admired, important. When this desire is unconscious, it creates behaviors that seek constant reassurance. You give too much. You sacrifice your truth. You chase connections that drain you. And when it collapses, you start again rebuilding the same illusion, hoping for a different outcome. Aversion plays a similar role. You avoid discomfort at all costs. You silence what's true to keep the peace. You shut down in conflict. You distract yourself from pain. But what you avoid grows stronger. And so the cycle continues, repeating until the avoidance becomes more painful than the feeling itself. Only then do you turn toward it. And when you do, the cycle starts to dissolve. Ignorance is the final thread, not stupidity, but unconsciousness. You act without knowing why. You say yes when you mean no. You perform roles that no longer reflect who you are. This kind of blindness keeps the wheel turning. It keeps you trapped in identities that were never yours to carry. The moment you begin to question, to pause, to feel, the light breaks through. You're no longer asleep in your own life. This is what rebirthing through samsara awareness means. Not leaving life, but waking up inside it. Not rejecting experience, but seeing it clearly enough to stop being consumed by it. You still feel. You still struggle. But now you have perspective. You understand that suffering often repeats not because you're broken, but because your awareness hasn't reached that part yet. You also realize that every cycle has a doorway. The pattern itself is not your prison, it's your teacher. The trigger that repeats is pointing somewhere. The emotion that floods you is guarding something. When you explore instead of resist, you begin to see the story behind the pattern, the identity it's trying to protect, the fear it's trying to avoid. And when that story is brought into the light, it begins to dissolve. The loop loosens, the energy shifts. And then something remarkable happens. You find that you no longer react in the same way. You pause before responding. You feel the old pattern rising, but you don't follow it. You stay with the discomfort, long enough to move through it instead of around it. This is liberation from the inside out. Not escape, but integration. Not perfection, but presence. This path is not about controlling life. It's about becoming more conscious inside it. You stop expecting people to change so you can feel safe. You stop needing circumstances to align for you to feel peace. You carry the awareness into every moment, and that awareness changes the outcome. You begin to live from a different center, not from fear or grasping, but from clarity. Samsara also teaches humility. You recognize that waking up is not a one-time event. It's a continuous return. You'll fall asleep again. You'll forget. You'll react. But each time, you remember more quickly. You see the loop sooner. You take responsibility more fully, and in that practice you build strength. Not the brittle kind that denies pain, but the kind that can hold it without falling apart. This strength becomes your foundation. You no longer fear the hard moments. You know they carry insight. You don't seek constant ease. You value depth. You stop needing to feel good all the time. You start wanting to feel truth, even when it hurts, even when it disrupts the comfort of old roles. You also begin to sense the deeper rhythms of your own life, the seasons of emotion, the tides of energy. You no longer fight your cycles, you honor them. You give space to grief. You allow joy to rise without gripping. You recognize that every ending holds the seed of beginning, that every fall is part of the spiral upward. You stop needing constant forward motion. You find healing in stillness, in returning, in staying present with the cycle instead of trying to escape it. This awareness becomes compassion. You see others inside their own loops. You stop taking their behavior personally. You recognize their patterns as you recognize your own. You become less reactive, less judgmental, more steady, more kind, not because you've detached, but because you've seen the deeper truth. Everyone is moving through their own samsara. Most people are spinning without knowing it. When you step off your own wheel for a moment, you become a refuge. You stop feeding conflict. You hold space instead. You stop trying to fix people. You become a mirror of presence. That's powerful. That's healing, not only for you but for those around you. And slowly, you begin to sense another way of being. A life not ruled by reaction, a heart not shaped by the past, a mind not pulled by every craving or fear. You still live, you still feel, but you move with intention, with clarity, with compassion. This is not the end of samsara, it's the awakening within it. You begin to walk through life more consciously. You notice when old loops call your name. You smile when you recognize the familiar pull, and instead of falling back into the spiral, you breathe, you watch, you choose differently, and in that choice you are reborn, not into a new identity but into presence. This is the practice, this is the rebirth, not through struggle but through seeing, not through resistance, but through release. You're not escaping life. You're entering it fully, awake, honest, free. The wheel of samsara may keep turning, but you are no longer asleep at its center. You are the awareness watching, the breath returning, the presence remembering. And that changes everything. When you stop living inside the cycle of unconscious reactions and begin to witness the rhythm of your emotional loops, something begins to shift, not just inside you, but in the way you relate to others. You no longer carry the same expectations. You stop needing life to be fair in the way your ego defines fairness. But even then, a more subtle challenge remains: the discomfort that arises when others experience joy, success, ease, especially when you are struggling. It's quiet, often unspoken, but powerful. It's the ache of jealousy, the resistance to another person's happiness when yours feels out of reach. This is the edge of the next transformation. Mudita is the practice of sympathetic joy. It is the ability to feel genuine happiness for someone else's good fortune, not just tolerate it, not just fake support, but to feel joy from their joy. It may sound simple, but it's one of the most difficult and most liberating heart practices in the Buddhist path. Because it confronts the deep conditioning of comparison, it challenges the belief that love, success, attention, and peace are scarce, that if someone else has more, you must have less. And this belief, often buried beneath awareness, creates quiet suffering. When you start to work with mudita, you begin to see how often joy for others is blocked. You catch the micro-reactions, the thought that says they didn't deserve it, the voice that says you've worked harder, the contraction in your chest when someone is praised, especially if you, 39, we've been overlooked. These are the subtle poisons of envy, not because you are a bad person, but because you are human, and unless they're seen with compassion, they stay hidden and continue to shape your emotional experience. The heart closes a little each time you reject another person's joy, not because you intend to, but because the ego wants to protect its story. It says, "Why not me?" It says, "They're ahead." It says, "I've been forgotten." But these statements are based on illusion. There is no finish line, no fixed place on the ladder. There is only the present moment and the way you choose to meet it. Mudita teaches you that someone else's happiness is not your loss. It is not a threat. It is not a verdict about your worth. When you learn to feel joy for someone else, you soften the part of yourself that feels left out. Because you stop reinforcing the lie that your value depends on comparison, you begin to heal the root of jealousy, not by suppressing it, but by meeting it with compassion. This doesn't happen through force. You don't replace envy with fake joy. You start by being honest. You notice where the resistance is. You feel the sting without adding shame. You pause. You breathe into it. And then you practice it slowly, deliberately. You bring to mind someone who is happy, someone who has achieved something meaningful. And you whisper inwardly, "May your joy continue. May your blessings grow. May you feel peace." At first, the words may feel hollow, but that's okay. You're not trying to force a feeling. You're planting a seed. Each time you practice, the heart softens, the grip of jealousy loosens, and in its place, space begins to grow. A space where connection can return, a space where love can expand. Because the truth is, when your heart celebrates someone else's joy, you heal your own pain. You shift from scarcity to abundance. You begin to realize that joy is not limited, that the light in another person does not dim yours, that we rise together, not at each other's expense. This shift rewires the nervous system. It teaches the body that joy is safe, that opening the heart doesn't mean losing ground, that softening doesn't mean weakness. You begin to feel how closed you've been, not by choice, but by habit, and now you have a practice that opens you gently. Mudita also heals relationships. Many conflicts are not rooted in anger, but in unspoken comparison. The subtle belief that you must compete for love, for attention, for recognition. This belief creates distance. It makes it hard to trust. It turns friendship into rivalry. But when you practice rejoicing in someone's joy, you begin to dissolve that distance. You build bridges where there were once walls. You learn to love without needing to win. And this love becomes a refuge, not only for others, but for you. Because the more you celebrate joy, the more joy you feel. You no longer wait for life to give you a reason to be happy. You find happiness in the happiness of the people around you. Your well-being is no longer limited to your own achievements. It expands. It includes more. It becomes shared. This doesn't mean ignoring your pain. It means expanding your capacity, holding space for both your sadness and their success, your grief and their celebration. You become emotionally mature not by suppressing what you feel, but by including more in your awareness. This maturity creates resilience. A heart that bends but does not break. And this kind of heart is powerful. It cannot be pulled into drama. It cannot be easily offended. It doesn't need to prove anything, because it is full, not from ego, but from connection, from presence, from love that is no longer transactional. This is where mudita becomes a force not passive, but transformative. It cuts through the illusion of separation. It teaches you that joy is not a resource to be divided. It is a quality to be shared. It is a medicine that multiplies when offered freely. And as you practice more deeply, you begin to notice something else. The people you once envied, when you celebrate their happiness, they start to feel like allies. Their light reminds you of what's possible. Their growth becomes inspiration, not comparison. You shift from insecurity to solidarity. You also start to notice who you struggle to feel joy for, not as a judgment, but as insight. These are the places where your own wounds still ask to be seen. Maybe it's the sibling who always seemed favored, the friend who always had what you lacked, the stranger whose success triggers old stories of not being enough. These people are teachers, not because they did something to you, but because their happiness touches a part of you that still wants healing. You meet these moments with honesty. You pause, you feel, you breathe, you offer the words anyway. May your joy continue. May you be well. May your happiness bring peace to others. Even when it feels hard, you say the words. Not because you have to, but because you're choosing to grow. And you grow. Each time you practice mudita, you weaken the roots of jealousy. You untangle the web of comparison. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's life, and you return to what is real, this breath, this heart, this moment. Eventually, it becomes natural. You hear good news and feel uplifted. You see someone shine and your placed heart opens. You stop resisting happiness in others, and because of that, you stop resisting your own. That's the quiet secret of mudita. When you rejoice in others, you stop blocking joy in yourself. You stop feeling like an outsider. You stop punishing yourself through comparison. You become a participant in life, not a competitor. And that participation feels like peace. It feels like warmth. It feels like coming home. Not just to others, but to the part of you that always wanted to feel worthy, that always longed to be enough. That part begins to relax, because it no longer has to fight. It no longer has to prove. It can just love and be loved, without keeping score. This is the liberation mudita offers, not by changing others, but by changing your relationship with their joy. Not through effort, but through intention. Not through denial, but through truth. You practice. You stay open. You let joy move through you even when it isn't yours directly. And in doing so, you realize it was always yours to begin with. Because joy, when shared, becomes belonging, becomes healing, becomes freedom. As joy for others begins to open the heart and dissolve the grip of comparison, a new kind of strength quietly rises. It's not loud, It doesn't shine like excitement or glow like happiness, but it holds. It holds when things go wrong. It holds when things don't make sense. It holds when the world feels like it's pulling you in 100 different directions. This strength has a name in Buddhist practice: upekkha, equanimity, a calm mind in the middle of chaos, a steady heart in the storm. Equanimity is not indifference. It's not a shield to block emotion. It's not pretending you don't care. It's not cold or detached. It's the opposite. It's full presence with what is without needing to change it. It's the ability to stay grounded in the middle of pain and pleasure, loss and gain, success and failure. Not numb, not passive, but centered, aware, open. This quality is difficult to cultivate because the world teaches you to react to praise with clinging, react to blame with defense, react to success with pride, react to failure with shame. It's a constant swing, a back and forth that keeps your nervous system in high alert. You're pulled toward what feels good, pushed away from what feels bad. But in both cases, you, 39, not free. You're being moved by circumstances. Equanimity breaks that pattern. It creates space between the event and the emotional storm. It allows you to feel fully, but respond wisely. You don't stop experiencing life, you stop being ruled by it. This shift is subtle, but powerful. It changes everything, especially in the moments where things don't go your way. When you begin to work with equanimity, you start by noticing your reactivity. The fast thoughts, the tightening, the urge to fix or escape. You start asking questions. Can I stay with this feeling without trying to change it? Can I let this discomfort pass through without identifying with it? Can I care without clinging? These questions guide you toward balance. Equanimity allows you to witness your emotions without collapsing into them. You feel the grief without drowning in it. You sense the anger without acting it out. You observe the joy without grasping at it. This isn't suppression, it's maturity. You let life move through you, and in doing so, you remain whole. One of the biggest misunderstandings about equanimity is that it means detachment from love. But true. Equanimity deepens love, because when you're not clinging to the outcome, you're free to care without fear. You no longer love to control. You love to give. You don't offer support because you need recognition. You do it because your heart is steady enough to give without needing anything back. That's what makes it resilient. Equanimity is also essential in conflict. When someone criticizes you, your instinct may be to defend or attack, but equanimity lets you pause. You hear the words, you feel the sting, but you don't react from the wound. You respond from clarity. Maybe you set a boundary. Maybe you speak your truth, but you do it from a grounded place, not a triggered one. This groundedness is what creates trust in yourself and in your relationships. People feel it. They feel the steadiness in your energy. They feel that you won't crumble under pressure or explode under stress. You become a calm space in a world that moves fast. That calm is not perfection, it's practice. A daily choice to come back to presence. Equanimity also supports emotional regulation. When highs and lows no longer control your behavior, you stop swinging between extremes. You don't lose yourself in excitement. You don't spiral in despair. You start noticing the in-between, the quiet middle ground where clarity lives. This doesn't mean you don't feel deeply. It means you stop being thrown by what you feel. You learn to observe pleasure without clinging. You enjoy it, but you don't chase it. You allow it to rise and fade without making it your identity. This frees you from the constant craving for more. It brings contentment, a quiet satisfaction that doesn't need stimulation to survive. You also learn to hold pain with gentleness. You stop resisting what hurts. You allow sadness to be part of your experience without making it your whole identity. You see that even in suffering, there's something steady beneath the waves. That awareness becomes your anchor. Upekkha also teaches you to stop trying to control what you cannot. Much of your stress comes from resistance, wanting life to follow your plan. But life doesn't follow your plan. People change. Outcomes surprise you. Nothing stays fixed. Equanimity doesn't stop the change, it stops your suffering about the prudera. Change. You let go, not because you don't care, but because clinging hurts more than release. This doesn't make you passive. Equanimity doesn't mean you stop trying. It means you stop needing. You still act. You still show up. But your happiness is no longer tied to the outcome. You can give your best and let go of the rest. This is how you move through life without burning out, without collapsing from the weight of expectation. And it applies not just to the big moments, but the small ones. When you're stuck in traffic, when someone speaks harshly, when plans fall apart. Instead of reacting with frustration or blame, you pause, you breathe, you remember that this too will pass. You remember that peace is available now, not after things go your way, but right in the middle of what's happening. This is not denial. You're not pretending things are fine when they aren't. You're simply refusing to add suffering to what's already difficult. You meet the moment with presence instead of resistance. That presence opens the door to wisdom. Because when you're not reactive, you can see more clearly. You make better choices. You speak with intention. You act with integrity. You don't waste energy on things that don't matter. You focus on what does. You become less dramatic, more discerning, less chaotic, more grounded. Equanimity also supports forgiveness, not just of others, but of yourself. You stop needing to be perfect. You stop punishing yourself for past mistakes. You recognize that growth is messy, that healing takes time. You give yourself space to be human, to fall and return, to hurt and repair. You stop holding on to regret like a badge. You begin again without judgment, without shame. And with this acceptance comes freedom. You stop expecting yourself to always be in control. You trust the process. You let life unfold without rushing to fix or escape. You learn to be with what is even when it's uncomfortable. That being with becomes healing. Equanimity also deepens your spiritual practice. Meditation is no longer about reaching a certain state. It becomes a place to observe without chasing, to sit in stillness without needing peace to feel peaceful. You watch the breath, you notice the thoughts, you feel the sensations, and you don't interfere. You let it all come and go. You train the mind to stay centered no matter what arises. This steadiness becomes a gift you carry into daily life. It shows up in how you listen, in how you wait, in how you hold space for uncertainty. You stop rushing into answers. You stop needing to fix what's uncomfortable. You start trusting that clarity comes from stillness, not force. Equanimity makes your heart more spacious. It gives you room to hold joy and sorrow without being pulled apart. It helps you stay open even when things don't make sense. It lets you care deeply without losing yourself. This kind of heart is rare, and it's needed, especially in a world that moves fast and feels fragmented. You don't cultivate upekkha overnight. You return to it again and again. When emotions rise, you notice. When chaos hits, you pause. When you forget, you begin again. It's not about staying calm forever. It's about remembering that calm is always available when you return to presence. And that return is everything. It's how you shift from being thrown to being steady, from reacting blindly to responding wisely, from feeling lost to feeling whole. Not because life got easier, but because you learned how to meet it differently. This is the subtle power of equanimity. It doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand, but it stays. It breathes, it waits, it opens. And in that quiet, steady presence, you find a kind of strength that no chaos can touch, a freedom that doesn't depend on conditions, a peace that isn't shaken by the world, but becomes a refuge inside it. Even as the heart learns to stay steady in the face of life's changes, something deeper still lingers quietly. Underneath it, all the unspoken truth that everything we hold, everyone we love, even this body we call home, will one day be gone. It is the truth most people avoid at all costs, even when they sense it. But for those on the path of clarity, it is not something to fear, it is something to turn toward. Because only when you bring death into view can you truly learn how to live. This practice is called Maranasati, mindfulness of death, not as an idea, but as a daily confrontation with impermanence. Facing death does not remove fear by making you numb. It removes fear by removing illusion. It reveals how much of your emotional suffering is rooted not in the present, but in your attachment to permanence. You suffer because you think things will stay the same, or should stay the same. You cling to identities, titles, grudges, expectations, as if they have no end. But everything has an end, and the sooner you allow that to be true, the lighter you become. This isn't meant to be bleak, it's meant to be clarifying. When you reflect on death, you begin to see what truly matters. Not someday in the future, but right now. The argument that felt so important starts to lose its sharpness. The need to prove yourself softens. The pressure to be liked fades, because in the face of mortality, ego has no weight. The roles you play, the things you collect, the opinions you defend, none of it follows you. And when you see this clearly, you start letting go of what never really served you. This letting go is emotional purification. You don't have to force forgiveness when you understand that holding resentment wastes time you don't have. You don't need to prove your worth when you realize how little external validation means in the final moments. Death reveals truth without apology. And if you're willing to sit with that truth, it becomes the most honest teacher you'll ever know. Maranasati is not about thinking of death to feel despair. It's about bringing death close enough that you stop postponing your life. You stop waiting for a better mood, a better version of yourself, a better time. You start living now, fully, with awareness. Because the illusion of endless time is the foundation of procrastination, avoidance, and fear. When you see clearly that life is short, you become bold in your presence. You stop leaking energy into what doesn't matter. This clarity changes your relationships. You speak more honestly. You listen more fully. You forgive more quickly. You start valuing people not for how they make you feel, but for who they are. You don't hold back affection. You don't wait to say what needs to be said. Because the truth is, none of us know how long we have. Every interaction could be the last. And that is not meant to scare you, it's meant to wake you up. Facing mortality also brings you back into your body, not in fear, but in gratitude. You begin to treat your life as a precious temporary gift. The breath becomes more sacred, the senses become more vivid. You feel time differently. You stop rushing through days and start honoring them, not by making them perfect, but by making them real. This shift dissolves a lot of inner noise. The worry about status, the endless planning, the comparison, the need to always be improving, all of it loses power. Not because you give up, but because you wake up. You begin to see how much suffering comes from the illusion that everything important is somewhere else, sometime later, with someone else. Maranasati pulls you back, not to fear, but to freedom. And that freedom opens the door to emotional truth. You stop pretending you have forever to heal. You start doing the work. You stop postponing the hard conversations. You start choosing peace over pride. You stop needing to be right. You start choosing connection, not because you're forced to, but because you know how precious each moment is. This awareness becomes a compass. When you have a difficult decision to make, you ask, what will matter at the end? When you face emotional turmoil, you ask, is this worth carrying? When you feel stuck in ego-based patterns, you ask, will this version of me exist when I die? The answers are often humbling. And in that humility, you become more human, more open, more real. Death contemplation also helps you release fear of change. If death is guaranteed, then every change before it is preparation. Every ending is a teacher. Every loss is a rehearsal. You start seeing life not as a line, but as a wave, rising and falling, appearing and vanishing. You stop grasping at the wave and start riding it. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only way to stay free. This practice also deepens spiritual grounding. You begin to sense what part of you is not defined by form. What part of you observes the passing of time, but does not age? You taste the part of consciousness that isn't afraid of endings, because it understands that nothing truly disappears, everything simply changes form. This doesn't remove grief, but it softens it. It brings compassion into sorrow. It adds love to goodbye. Maranasati also clears emotional clutter. You no longer need to carry every regret, every missed chance, every old version of yourself. You see how much weight you, 39, you've been holding out of habit. And one by one, you start laying it down. You stop being loyal to who you were and start being true to who you are. This is emotional purification, not through pressure, but through perspective. You don't need a crisis to start this practice. You don't need to wait for illness, loss, or aging. You can begin now, sitting quietly, breathing deeply, bringing to mind the reality that this life is temporary, that this moment is sacred, that this breath is not promised. You might feel discomfort. That's okay. Discomfort is part of the process. It means you're stepping outside the trance of permanence. You're seeing clearly, maybe for the first time. And clarity always brings some pain, but also great peace. That peace shows up in how you move through the world. You stop needing control. You stop clinging to plans. You allow life to surprise you. You appreciate more, demand less. You stop looking for security in things that fade. You find it in presence. You also become more compassionate with others, because when you know that everyone you meet will die, including you, you become softer, kinder, less reactive. You stop wasting time on drama. You don't need to make people into enemies. You see their fear, their confusion, their struggle. You see their humanity, and you meet it with yours. Death awareness is not separate from emotional healing. It is the root of it, because most emotional pain comes from holding on too tightly to roles, to resentment, to stories that no longer serve. When you reflect on death, you loosen that grip, you let things be as they are, you forgive more, not because you have to, but because you want to be free. And freedom becomes the center of your practice. You begin to live with fewer illusions. You stop waiting for perfect conditions. You start showing up fully now. You laugh more. You cry more easily. You express what matters. You live like your time means something, because it does. There is no need to fear death when you are fully alive. And being fully alive doesn't mean chasing constant joy. It means being present, being honest, being aware. It means letting your life be simple and real, and that realness is what brings peace. Maranasati brings you back to your essence, not your achievements, not your image, just the raw presence of being, the awareness that watches thoughts, the breath that carries life, the stillness underneath all emotion. That stillness is not something you create, it's what remains when you stop clinging. So you return to it each day, not out of dread, but out of devotion, not to what might be lost, but to what is here, now, alive. You give thanks, not just in words, but in action. You live each moment as a sacred one, not because it's perfect, but because it's fleeting. This is the heart of death contemplation, not sadness, not fear, but clarity, peace, presence, and through it, you purify the heart not by force, but by remembering what truly matters. You live not to escape death, but to be ready for it. Not with regret, but with a full, open, grounded heart. And that is the greatest freedom of all. When you bring death into awareness and allow it to soften your grip on what doesn't last, your relationship with everything changes. You stop chasing what drains you. You stop feeding emotions that waste your time. Life becomes more simple, more honest, more intentional. This clarity opens a path that few dare to walk, the path of emotional discipline. Not control through suppression, but freedom, through simplicity. The same way Buddhist monks live with only what is needed, you begin to wonder, what would it look like to apply that kind of clarity to your inner life? The monastic code, known as the Vinaya, was not created to restrict joy. It was designed to remove excess, to protect what is most valuable by stripping away what distracts from it. It is not about denial, it's about refinement. A monk doesn't need to decide what to wear, what to eat, where to go. Their path is set. This structure is not rigidity, it's protection from chaos. It frees the mind from 1,000 unnecessary choices. Now apply this inward. Your emotional world, left unchecked, often becomes full of clutter, constant commentary, lingering judgments, recycled arguments, future rehearsals, and past regrets. Most of this content doesn't serve healing or clarity. It creates noise. Without realizing it, your mental landscape becomes crowded with emotions that repeat not because they're meaningful, but because they've never been questioned. Emotional minimalism begins with honest observation. You start to notice what arises in your inner world without labeling it right or wrong. Not all feelings require full engagement. Not every irritation needs to be expressed. Not every insecurity needs a response. Much of what passes through your mind is a reflection of habit, not truth. This is where discipline becomes essential. Not harshness, but the kind of care that sets boundaries with your own inner reactivity. The Vinaya offers a model, not as a fixed system for lay life, but as inspiration, for simplification. Monks eat at certain times, not because hunger is bad, but because consistency helps quiet the body. You begin to see how this applies emotionally. You start asking, how many times am I letting the same frustration rise without inquiry? How much emotional energy is going toward repeating something I can't change? You begin reducing emotional noise the way a monk reduces possessions. You examine each emotion the way you would examine an object. Does it serve a purpose? Does it bring clarity? Is it necessary right now? If not, you let it go, not with force, but with care. This process requires deep awareness. You learn to recognize the difference between pain that asks to be felt and pain that is feeding on itself. Many emotional reactions come from unresolved stories. When left unexamined, they demand constant energy. Every slight becomes a battle. Every delay becomes a threat. Every silence becomes rejection. These interpretations are not facts, they're habits. Emotional minimalism helps you create space between the event and the reaction. You stop feeding the flame just because you feel heat. This doesn't mean you become passive or detached. It means you stop assuming every emotional impulse deserves expression. You begin to curate your inner responses. You ask yourself, is this reaction leading me closer to peace or further into confusion? You don't judge the feeling, but you choose whether or not to follow it. The more you do this, the more stillness you begin to experience. Emotional space returns. You feel less exhausted. You stop reacting to things that used to consume hours of thought. You move through daily life with more ease because your inner dialogue isn't constantly in motion. This creates strength not through pushing, but through lightness. Another lesson from the Vinaya is restraint in speech. Monks are taught to speak only when it is necessary, true, and beneficial. This principle can be applied internally. Not every thought needs to be followed. Not every inner voice needs to be given power. You begin to filter your inner speech not to silence yourself, but to become more precise. You speak to yourself as you would to someone you love, clearly, kindly, with intention. This also changes how you respond to others. When you're not overwhelmed by your own emotional clutter, you can listen more deeply. You don't react to provoke or defend. You respond when it's helpful. You remain quiet when that serves better. You conserve energy not by avoiding people, but by choosing which emotional paths are worth walking. Emotional minimalism is not cold, it's clean. It removes the stickiness of constant drama. It allows real feeling to rise without being buried under layers of reactivity. You can feel sadness fully without letting it spiral into despair. You can experience joy without becoming attached to its return. You can hold anger as information without letting it harden your heart. The result is emotional efficiency. You do not stop feeling, but what you feel is no longer distorted by excess interpretation. You see clearly. You act from clarity. You stay in alignment with your values rather than being swept by temporary urges. This is not repression, it's maturity. Applying the spirit of the Vinaya to your emotional life also invites consistency. You begin to set inner commitments, not rigid rules, but intentions. For example, you may decide not to speak when angry until the body has softened. You may choose to pause before responding to any request. You may set time daily to reflect without distraction. These small disciplines create inner spaciousness. Over time, this spaciousness becomes your foundation. You stop being a container for emotional noise. You become a vessel for calm, for kindness, for wisdom. You stop getting pulled into arguments that go nowhere. You don't absorb energy that isn't yours. You move with less friction, not because life is smooth, but because you are no longer adding resistance. You also become more aligned with your deeper intentions. When emotional clutter is reduced, your actions become clearer. You are less likely to say something you regret. You are more likely to follow through on what matters. You start living in a way that reflects your deepest values, not your passing moods. This way of being is not about isolation. It's about inner clarity. Emotional minimalism makes room for connection, because when you are not carrying your own unresolved noise, you can show up fully for others. You can listen without projecting. You can support without fixing. You can love without control. And this becomes your practice, a daily return to simplicity, a gentle pruning of what is not needed, not just in the outer world, but within your heart. You let go of stories that never belong to you. You release roles that no longer reflect who you are. You stop carrying emotions just because they are familiar. What remains is a kind of lightness, a presence that is full, not crowded, a heart that is open, not scattered. This is the gift of emotional minimalism, not silence for its own sake, but silence that reveals clarity, not suppression, but sovereignty. You begin to live with less noise, less confusion, and more intention. And this intention becomes peace in not because everything is perfect, but because everything unnecessary has been set down. You are no longer overwhelmed by your own reactions. You are no longer tangled in mental clutter. You have space to feel, to breathe, to be. This is not about becoming a monk in the world. It's about borrowing the wisdom of discipline to clear the way, to live without the constant pull of every emotion, to choose what you carry, to honor your life not by adding more but by holding less, more fully. As you begin to live with less emotional clutter and move through life with deeper clarity, something becomes undeniable. The patterns in your life, your triggers, your responses, the lessons that return again and again are not random. They aren't punishments, they're echoes. Every action, every intention, every reaction leaves a trace. That trace doesn't disappear. It returns, not as fate, but as consequence, not as control, but as a mirror. This is the heart of karma vipaka, the law of cause and effect, the relationship between intention and result. And it holds the key to emotional accountability. Understanding this law is not about fear or superstition. It's about reclaiming your part in how your inner world takes shape. Karma means action, especially intentional action. Vipaka means result. What you think, feel, say, and do leaves impressions. Those impressions condition your future experience, not because you are being judged, but because energy moves in cycles. Once you see that clearly, blame starts to lose its grip. You stop asking why life is unfair and start asking what choices are feeding your pain. You stop waiting for others to change and begin looking at how your own habits shape your reality. This understanding shifts the focus inward, not to isolate you, but to empower you. Many people carry the weight of emotional victimhood for years. They feel trapped by past harm, by unfair treatment, by betrayal. And while pain is real, staying trapped in the belief that your freedom depends on someone else's apology only prolongs your suffering. Karma doesn't ask you to excuse harm, it asks you to see what you are continuing to feed. You can't control the past, but you can control what you do with what it left behind. Emotional accountability begins when you start tracing your reactions to their roots. You feel anger rise, and instead of projecting it outward, you ask, what story am I keeping alive that's fueling this? You feel anxiety surge and ask, what habit of thought am I practicing that's deepening this fear? You experience rejection and ask, how am I interpreting this moment based on old pain? These questions aren't about blame, they're about awareness. Without that awareness, the same situations keep returning, not because you deserve them, but because something in you is still responding the same way. Kamavipaka is not about punishment, it's about pattern. It's the understanding that your inner world is built on repetition. What you practice becomes your default. If you repeatedly respond to challenge with avoidance, that becomes your pathway. If you constantly numb pain instead of exploring it, that becomes your baseline. The law is neutral, it doesn't care what you choose, but it will return the fruits of whatever you plant. If you sow self-compassion, patience, and responsibility, the result will eventually match. If you sow blame, denial, and reactivity, the result will also reflect that. This principle invites deep honesty. You stop asking what life owes you and start asking what you're cultivating. You stop waiting for peace to appear and begin looking at the ways you're resisting it. You examine your thoughts, not just for truth, but for consequence. You realize that indulging in resentment feels powerful in the moment, but leaves a trace that returns in future interactions. You start choosing emotional responses that align with your deeper intentions, not your passing moods. One of the most important realizations in this practice is that not every painful event is the result of a personal fault. Karma is complex. Not everything you experience is because of something you did, but everything you feel in response to that experience is yours to hold. That distinction is freedom. You can't always choose the conditions of your life, but you can always choose how you meet them, and that choice builds the path ahead. Accountability does not mean self-blame. It means refusing to abandon yourself. It means taking full ownership of your reactions without falling into guilt. When you respond to harm with compassion instead of revenge, you stop the cycle. When you choose patience in a moment of frustration, you don't erase your pain, but you refuse to feed it further. Every time you choose awareness over impulse, you interrupt the loop, and that interruption creates space. Space to heal, space to redirect, space to choose again. This also applies to your relationship with others. Karma invites you to be mindful of how your emotional energy affects those around you. Every word, every gesture, every silent reaction has weight. It ripples outward, and it returns. When you speak with harshness, even if you feel justified, you plant seeds of mistrust. When you listen with real presence, even when it's difficult, you plant seeds of safety. The more you become aware of these impacts, the more you choose alignment over reaction. Not because you're policing yourself, but because you understand the value of your energy. This awareness is not about perfection, it's about direction. You're not trying to erase all negative emotion. You're learning to hold it differently, to work with it instead of from it. That difference is what creates long-term transformation. The more you practice this, the more your life begins to reflect it. You find yourself surrounded by less chaos, not because the world changed, but because your responses stopped fueling the fire. Kamavipaka also teaches humility. When you understand that your current reality is influenced by countless past actions, you stop needing to always be right. You realize that sometimes pain returns not as punishment, but as an echo of something you didn't fully feel. Sometimes the lesson reappears, not because you failed, but because you're ready to meet it in a deeper way. This view softens your relationship with difficulty. You stop taking challenges as personal attacks and start meeting them as teachers. This approach changes how you grow. You stop looking for shortcuts. You understand that healing is not about fixing, but about refining your response. You no longer expect immediate results. You plant intentions and tend to them daily, knowing that the fruits come in their own time. This patience becomes your foundation. It keeps you steady even when life is unpredictable. Understanding karma also helps you make peace with the past. You begin to see that while you can't undo past harm, you can stop repeating its energy. You can choose not to carry the same anger. You can choose to act from wisdom, even if others never did. This breaks generational cycles. It rewrites personal stories. It liberates not only you, but those who come after you. You also become more conscious of your inner dialogue, because every thought carries energy. When you rehearse self-judgment, you plant seeds of doubt. When you speak to yourself with encouragement, you plant seeds of confidence. This is not about positive thinking, it's about energetic accuracy. You begin to ask, is this thought creating the kind of inner world I want to live in? If not, you redirect not by force, but by intention. Over time, emotional accountability becomes a form of self-respect. You no longer let your mood control your behavior. You stop blaming others for how you feel. You take responsibility for your choices without falling into shame. You become more centered, more grounded, more resilient, not because life stopped being difficult, but because you stopped giving your power away. This is the strength that grows when you understand cause and effect. You become less reactive and more intentional, less defensive and more reflective. You stop feeding the patterns that drain you. You start building the ones that support who you truly want to be. And in doing so, you move from victimhood to authorship. You are no longer defined by your wounds. You are shaped by your choices. Every day becomes a practice. Every moment, a chance to begin again. Not to perfect yourself, but to live in a way that aligns with truth, clarity, and compassion. This is the quiet power of Kamma Vipaka, not fear of what may come, but confidence in what you're creating. Not guilt over the past, but gratitude for the ability to choose differently. This is how you return to wholeness, one intention, one response, one clear moment at a time. As you begin to take full responsibility for your inner world, something unexpected starts to open. A tenderness that's not rooted in weakness, but in strength. When you stop blaming and start observing, when you stop reacting and start responding, you no longer see suffering, yours or others, as something to avoid. You start feeling it differently. It's not a threat. It becomes something that can be held, and holding suffering with awareness is the beginning of compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. From here, you're ready to enter a deeper practice, one that transforms emotional heaviness at its root. This is where the path turns toward tonglen. Tonglen is a practice of radical transformation. It means taking in suffering and sending out healing. In the Mahayana tradition, it is a powerful form of compassion meditation, but it's not about being self-sacrificial. It's not about absorbing everyone's pain until you collapse. It's about working directly with the heart, 39's capacity to expand, to hold more, to cleanse what we usually resist, to breathe through the very emotions we once believed were unbearable, and in doing so, something purifies not just for you, but for the whole field of awareness. In this version of tonglen, rooted in Buddhist insight and adapted for emotional detox, the breath becomes the gateway. You breathe in pain not to keep it, but to meet it. You breathe out compassion not just to help others, but to cleanse your own resistance. This may sound reversed from most emotional survival strategies. That's because it is. Most people try to exhale their stress and inhale only peace. But here, you begin to trust that your heart is strong enough to do the opposite. You allow the breath to move into the wound, not around it, and as you do, something begins to loosen. This practice is not about fixing suffering, it's about transforming your relationship with it. You start by acknowledging a specific emotional pain, yours or someone else's. It might be grief, loneliness, anger, or fear. You breathe it in on the inhale. You don't push it away. You let it move through the body, meeting it without panic. As you breathe out, you offer whatever healing quality feels most natural: ease, forgiveness, clarity, space. The breath becomes a current of alchemy. With practice, this shift changes how you experience discomfort. Instead of resisting painful moments, you enter them. You become curious. You stop seeing emotion as a problem and start seeing it as energy that can be held and transmuted. The inhale becomes a gesture of courage. The exhale becomes a gift. Not only do you stop adding to the emotional weight you carry, you begin to release it. This release doesn't come through escape, it comes through presence. Tonglen works because it teaches you to stop turning away. You learn to sit with your discomfort until it transforms. This doesn't mean the pain vanishes. It means it no longer owns you. You're not rejecting or denying. You're choosing to work with what is, inhaling what hurts, exhaling what heals. This practice also disrupts emotional defensiveness. Often when others are in pain, we protect ourselves by turning away. We don't want to feel it. We call it empathy fatigue. But fatigue often comes not from feeling too much, but from resisting what we feel. Tonglen allows the feeling to move through so it doesn't get stuck. You breathe it in with awareness, you breathe out with love. The mind softens, the heart clears. With this shift, compassion stops being an idea. It becomes a physical experience. You feel it rise, move, and change your state. You sense the difference between forced kindness and embodied care. And the more you practice, the more spacious your inner world becomes. You stop fearing difficult emotions. You start respecting them, not for what they say about you, but for what they reveal. You begin to notice that your personal suffering is not so different from others. Your loneliness is not unique. Your shame is not isolated. There is a shared field of pain. When you breathe it in, you're not just healing yourself, you're making contact with the human experience. You stop separating yourself from others. Their struggles no longer feel like burdens, they feel like reflections. And from this place, compassion becomes natural, not as something you try to feel, but something you are. This softens judgment. You stop needing to measure who deserves your care. You understand that suffering is the only credential required. Someone doesn't need to be right to receive your compassion. They just need to be hurting. And so do you. Tonglen becomes a bridge back to yourself, a way to meet your inner critic without fear. You breathe in the voice that says you're not enough. You exhale forgiveness. You breathe in the memory that still stings. You exhale understanding. This is not self-indulgence, it's self-liberation. You are breaking the habit of war within. You're replacing resistance with tenderness. Each breath becomes a ritual of release, a moment of trust, a step toward freedom. And this freedom does not isolate you, it connects you. The more you practice tonglen, the more connected you feel to those around you. Their anger doesn't scare you, their fear doesn't shut you down. You see what's underneath, you feel it. And because you've met those emotions in yourself, you can hold them without panic. This is what makes tonglen such a powerful form of emotional detox. It doesn't remove your feelings, it clears your relationship with them. It makes space, and in that space, grace flows. Grace that doesn't need justification, grace that isn't earned. It just rises like breath from presence. Eventually, you learn to practice tonglen in real time, not just in meditation, but in daily life. Someone lashes out, you breathe in their pain. You breathe out steadiness. You feel triggered, you breathe in the heat. You breathe out calm. You don't suppress, you circulate. You let emotion move like air, not trapped, not avoided, but met with awareness. This changes how you live. You stop carrying the emotional weight of unprocessed reactions. You don't store the resentment. You don't stockpile the blame. You meet it. You breathe it in. You offer something cleaner, something more honest. And in that process, you heal not through distance, but through contact. The deeper you go into this practice, the more grounded your compassion becomes. It stops being fragile. It becomes resilient. You can be in the presence of pain without collapsing. You can show up fully without needing to fix. You realize that presence itself is healing, that witnessing is not passive, it's powerful. Tonglen gives you a way to turn every breath into a prayer not for escape, but for transformation. You stop needing everything to feel good. You begin to trust that even what hurts can purify you, not by removing it, but by holding it differently. Over time, this becomes your way of being. You no longer avoid discomfort. You serve it. You let it speak. You let it move. And then, you let it go. This is the path of compassion, not as sentiment, but as practice. Not as feeling, but as action. Inhaling what is real. Exhaling what is possible. Meeting pain with courage. Offering grace with every breath. And letting that breath carry you toward freedom. One moment, one inhale, one exhale at a time. When you breathe in suffering and breathe out compassion, something begins to break open quietly. You stop fearing the weight of emotion. You stop resisting the hurt that others carry. You even start to soften toward the pain you've been carrying for years. But there's one wound that often resists even the deepest breathwork: resentment. Not because it's stronger, but because it's sticky. It holds on in silence. It ties itself to memory, identity, justice. And yet, no matter how justified, it creates tension in the heart. Forgiveness, then, becomes not a gift for someone else, but a sacred release for yourself. This is the dharma of forgiveness. Forgiveness in Buddhism is not an obligation. It is not a moral demand. It is a path. It is a shift from contraction to openness. It doesn't mean forgetting, excusing, or dismissing what happened. It means choosing not to suffer a second time. It means deciding that the pain you experienced will not be what continues to shape your emotional life. You reclaim authority over your inner space, not by changing the past, but by changing your relationship to it. Forgiveness begins with honesty. You have to acknowledge what you're holding before you can begin to loosen it. You have to name the pain, the betrayal, the boundary that was crossed. You let yourself feel it fully, not to replay it, but to recognize its presence. Only then can you meet it with awareness. Most resentment lingers because it's unexamined. It becomes background noise, coloring your mood, shaping your tone, hardening your thoughts. Once you bring it into the light, you begin to see it clearly, and clarity makes release possible. Resentment can feel like control, like protection. It says, if I let this go, they win. But that is a misunderstanding. Holding on doesn't make you strong, it makes you tired. It drains your energy and poisons your presence. Forgiveness doesn't erase the wound, it removes the hook. You're no longer bound to the moment, to the person, to the story. You're free to move forward. The Buddha taught that hatred is like holding a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. This is not just metaphor. Emotionally, resentment creates tension in the body, in the breath, in the nervous system. You carry the energy of the past into the present. Forgiveness is not about pretending. It's about choosing not to burn anymore. This choice doesn't come all at once. It often happens in layers. You might begin with the intention to forgive, even while part of you still feels resistance. That's okay. The intention is the opening. You don't force your way there. You walk slowly. You create space. You invite compassion. First for yourself, the part of you that was hurt, for the part of you that still struggles to let go. That compassion melts the edges of the story. It begins to shift the emotional texture. Then, slowly, you begin to include the other person in that field of compassion. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve freedom. You begin to understand that everyone acts from their conditioning, that even harmful actions come from confusion, from fear, from pain. This understanding doesn't justify what happened, but it helps you stop personalizing it. You see that people harm others when they are disconnected from themselves, when they have not healed, when they cannot see clearly. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. You can forgive someone and never speak to them again. You can forgive and still hold boundaries. You can forgive without returning to the same dynamic. The purpose is not to restore relationship. The purpose is to restore peace in your own mind, to clear space in your heart for the life that is unfolding now. Forgiveness also has layers within yourself. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is not someone else, it's you. The choices you regret, the words you wish you hadn't said, the things you didn't do. These moments leave an imprint. Without forgiveness, they become part of your identity. You walk around not just with pain, but with guilt, shame, and self-judgment. These emotions harden the heart just as much as anger toward others. Self-forgiveness is a practice of humility and truth. You face what happened without excuses, but also without cruelty. You recognize that your past self acted from a certain level of awareness, that you were learning just like everyone else. You do not erase responsibility, you embrace it. And then you begin to release the judgment. You stop punishing a version of yourself that no longer exists. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest. You carry the lesson, not the shame. You hold the commandant at all. Memory, not the blame. This shift creates space to grow. It allows you to evolve without dragging your past like a shadow. You begin to trust that redemption is not earned by suffering, it's found in presence, in courage, in making different choices now. Forgiveness also clears the way for deeper wisdom. When you release resentment, you can finally hear what the experience taught you. Pain is a teacher, but only when you stop arguing with it. The lesson is not always immediate. Sometimes it reveals itself after time. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, in quiet insights. You learn about your boundaries, your needs, your patterns. You learn about courage, empathy, and resilience. You become someone who has walked through fire without being consumed. The structured path to forgiveness includes a few essential steps. First, honesty. You acknowledge the truth of what happened. Second, feeling. You allow the emotions to rise without rushing. Third, compassion. You bring kindness to the pain. Fourth, understanding. You reflect on the conditions that led to the harm. Fifth, release. You set the intention to let go because the pain wasn't real, but because you are ready to stop carrying it. This is not a formula, it's a process. You may repeat the steps many times. Each round peels back another layer. Each breath opens more space. You begin to feel lighter, not because everything is more space, resolved, but because you are no longer resisting reality. Forgiveness is not a one-time decision, it's a path of return. Each time the resentment rises again, you return to presence. You remember your intention, you breathe, you soften, you let go again. This repetition builds strength, not the strength to fight, but the strength to love without needing to hold pain as armor. The Dharma teaches that everything is impermanent. This includes your anger, your hurt, your grudges. They are not fixed, they are passing. When you cling to them, they stay longer. When you observe them, they move. Forgiveness is the letting go that allows new life to grow in their place. You begin to relate to others differently. You no longer need to keep score. You no longer need to hold grudges as protection. You move through the world more lightly. You give more grace, not because others always deserve it, but because you have seen what withholding it does to your own heart. Eventually, you begin to live from forgiveness. It becomes a way of being. You don't expect perfection from yourself or others. You recognize that everyone is doing their best with the awareness they have. You stay clear, but also soft, boundaried, but open, honest, but loving. This is not about surrendering your truth. It's about letting go of the weight that truth does not need. You speak what is real. You feel what is present. You release what is no longer needed. This is the balance the Dharma of forgiveness offers. Forgiveness becomes a form of wisdom, a way to see clearly without clinging to pain, a way to return to yourself without dragging the past behind you. A sacred act of healing that opens the door to joy, to freedom, and to peace, not in some distant future, but here, now, in the space of a soft breath and a willing heart. When you learn to forgive and not to forget, but to be free, you begin to understand that freedom is less about what you remove from your life and more about what you no longer cling to. Resentment fades. Judgment loosens. But even after the conscious release, something deeper remains. The subtle tendency to grasp. The pull to hold on, not only to memories and stories, but to identity, feelings, and even suffering itself. And to truly release, you need to understand where that clinging begins. This is where the path leads into the heart of Buddhist insight, paticca-samuppada, or dependent origination. This teaching shows how suffering doesn't 39 just appear. It builds, step by step, moment by moment, one condition feeding the next. It is not random, and it is not permanent. When you see the sequence, clearly you don't just soothe symptoms, you cut the roots. This is not abstract philosophy. It is a detailed map of how your emotional world is formed, how it becomes tangled, and how to unwind it with care. The chain of dependent origination traditionally begins with ignorance. Ignorance is not lack of information. It is the absence of direct seeing. It's the way we overlook the nature of reality. It is the moment we forget that all things are impermanent, that no experience is personal, and that nothing stands alone. From this forgetting, the whole chain of reactivity begins, because the moment you forget truth, you grasp illusion. From ignorance comes mental formations, your habits, your tendencies, your deeply embedded responses. These shape how you interpret everything that follows. You don't just see a moment, you filter it through conditioning. If your habit is fear, even neutral experiences feel like threats. If your habit is self-doubt, even kindness feels suspicious. You are not reacting to life, you are reacting to your own projections. From mental formations comes consciousness, the awareness that links your past tendencies to the present moment. This consciousness colors perception. It determines what you notice and what you ignore. It decides which memories surface, which fears awaken, and which emotions rise first. From consciousness comes name and form. This is how you identify experience. You call it good or bad. You say, "This is me," or "This is not me." You create a sense of self around what is happening. You don't just feel sadness, you call it your sadness. You don't just experience anger, you make it personal. And with this personalization comes attachment. From name and form come the six sense basis: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. These are the doors through which experience enters. They are neutral on their own, but the moment you add interpretation, they become fuel for craving or aversion. A tone of voice can feel like rejection. A facial expression can trigger insecurity. Even a passing thought can spark old stories. From the six senses comes contact, the moment your internal world meets the external world. You hear something, see something, feel something, and this is where the emotional spark begins. Contact itself is not suffering, but it leads to the next link, feeling. Feeling arises with every contact, not only physical sensation, but emotional tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. These feelings are not problems, but they quickly become sticky. Pleasant feelings lead to craving. Unpleasant ones lead to aversion. Neutral ones often lead to boredom or ignorance, but all three, if grasped, lead to the same place, clinging. This is the critical moment. The link between feeling and craving is where most suffering begins. You feel something good, and you want it to stay. You feel something bad, and you want it to stop. You feel something neutral, and you ignore it. The problem is not the feeling, it's the attachment. You don't suffer because of what you feel. You suffer because of how tightly you hold it. Craving, the next link, is the thirst, the hunger for more pleasure, more certainty, more control. Craving fuels action. It pulls you forward with tension. It says, "I need this to be okay," or "I can't be happy until this changes." Craving makes you believe peace lives in the next moment, the next achievement, the next emotional high, and so you chase endlessly. From craving comes clinging, the hardening of identity around desire. You don't just want something you build a self around the wanting. I am someone who needs this. I am someone who deserves that. I am someone who was hurt by this. This clinging defines you. It traps you in old roles, old pain, old narratives, and it gives rise to becoming. Becoming is the emotional momentum that turns temporary feelings into fixed patterns. It's the story that plays on repeat. It's the way you keep recreating the same relationship, the same conflict, the same reaction, even with different people. Becoming is not fate, is momentum, and it leads to birth. In this context, birth doesn't mean physical birth. It means the arising of a new emotional self, a new identity built from the old materials. Every time you cling, a new version of your ego is born. The hurt one, the betrayed one, the anxious one. This version begins to live and act as if it is who you truly are. But all birth leads to aging and death. Emotionally, this means every identity you cling to will decay. Every role you construct will eventually collapse. And when it does, you feel loss, confusion, grief. This is not punishment. It is the natural result of building on unstable ground. Understanding this cycle gives you power not to control life, but to stop feeding what harms you. You begin to work backwards. You notice the feeling and pause before craving. You see the contact and investigate before labeling. You recognize the sense impression and stay present rather than reacting. You watch the mind form stories, and instead of believing them, you question. With each step interrupted, suffering softens. This is the art of letting go, not as a final act, but as a continuous awareness. You don't wait for the peak of pain. You trace the root. You feel where the tension begins, where identity tightens, where resistance forms, and you soften. You choose not to follow the chain. You allow the energy to settle instead of escalate. This requires practice. It's not a mental concept, it's a moment-to-moment discipline. You become familiar with your own pattern. You know the steps, you feel the sequence, and when you catch it early, you return to clarity faster. You no longer let temporary states define permanent identity. Dependent origination is not just a teaching, it's a tool, a way to see the architecture of emotional struggle and to disassemble it piece by piece. It shows that nothing arises alone, that pain is not personal, that suffering is not inevitable. It reveals that freedom is not in avoiding pain, but in not building extra walls around it. As you begin to live this understanding, your relationship with emotion changes. You stop chasing pleasure. You stop fearing discomfort. You become less reactive to the highs and lows. You feel deeply, but you don't cling. You respond with wisdom, not habit. You stay present with whatever arises, knowing it too is conditioned, impermanent, and not self. This presence creates space. Space to see clearly, space to choose, space to let go. And in that space, freedom is no longer an idea, it becomes your lived experience, one that is not built on escape, but on insight, not on control, but on awareness. You don't have to wait for pain to pass. You don't have to run from longing. You just need to see how they are built and stop adding bricks. This is the quiet liberation that comes from understanding paticcasamuppada, a release not through resistance, but through wisdom, a clarity that grows with every moment of mindfulness, a strength born, not from holding on, but from knowing how and when to let go. And in that letting go, you return not to numbness, not to avoidance, but to the simplicity of being fully alive, without story, without clinging, just here, just free. When you begin to notice how emotions are constructed, how they rise from a chain of reactions and interpretations, you start to realize that the pain itself is not the biggest weight. What weighs you down is the story that forms around the pain, the assumptions, the projections, the explanations you build, without checking if they're true. Most suffering does not come from what happened. It comes from what the mind tells you it means. The path to freedom now leads to a practice that cuts through the web of storytelling and brings you back to what is real. This is the wisdom of Yatha Bhuta, seeing things as they actually are. This is not philosophical distance. It's a discipline of perception. To see clearly is to separate what is true from what is added. You don't remove the experience, you remove the layers. You take the emotion out of the narrative. You observe the sensation without attaching identity to it. This kind of perception dissolves emotional confusion. It stops the habit of turning every moment into a judgment about who you are or what others think of you. Yatha Bhuta is not about detachment from life. It's about contact with reality. You stop reacting to the version of the moment your mind has created and start responding to what is actually present. That shift is small on the surface, but it changes everything. You begin to notice that when pain arises, it does so cleanly. A tight chest, a dry throat, a wave of sadness. But then the story arrives. This always happens. To me, I'll never be okay. They shouldn't have done that. I'm not enough. It is in that story where the entanglement forms. Seeing things as they are means pausing before the interpretation, staying with the raw experience long enough to know it directly, to feel without explanation, to sense without assigning blame. This practice is a kind of inner honesty. It trains you to recognize when your mind starts building and to gently stop feeding it. You ask, what do I know for sure in this moment? Not what do I assume or what do I believe, but what do I see? This kind of perception can be practiced in any moment. Something discomforts you, a message left unanswered, a change in someone's tone, a shift in your body. Immediately the mind begins to explain. But if you're paying attention, you can interrupt it. You can feel the discomfort before assigning a reason. You can notice the emotion before deciding what it says about you. In that space, awareness opens. You see the difference between the feeling and the story wrapped around it. This space is where disentanglement begins. You are no longer bound to your mental narrative. You don't deny it, but you don't collapse into it either. You become a witness to your own interpretations. You watch how your mind adds layer show. It makes conclusions before questions are even asked. This witnessing does not remove your feelings, but it removes your attachment to their meaning. Practicing Yatha Bhuta requires training the mind to slow down. Emotional reactivity is fast. It jumps to conclusions. It assumes it understands. It wants to protect. But protection based on imagination becomes overreaction. When you train in seeing directly, you allow the emotion to rise and fall without being taken hostage by it. You start to observe its texture instead of its justification. You feel what's happening without needing to know why. This directness makes you more emotionally honest. You stop pretending not to feel, but you also stop pretending you know everything about what you feel. You begin to see that not all pain is what it seems. That some sadness is about old memories. That some anger is just fear in another form. That some discomfort doesn't need to be solved, it just needs to be felt. The practice of Yatha Bhuta doesn't avoid emotion, it refines it. It teaches you to feel what's actually present, not what habitually arises from interpretation. For example, when someone criticizes you, instead of leaping into shame or defense, you stay with the basic impact. Words were spoken. A reaction occurred. That's all. You don't build a conclusion. You stay with sensation, the breath, the heart rate, the energy in your body. You observe with calm curiosity and you let it move. This gives you access to emotional neutrality, not numbness but openness. You're no longer bound to only seeing through your perspective. You stop assuming intent. You stop personalizing what may not be personal. You learn to hold the unknown with steadiness, to feel without labeling, to experience without collapsing into meaning. Yathabhuta also helps you break through distorted patterns. Many emotional loops continue because you keep confirming your own beliefs through selective interpretation. You expect rejection, so you see it everywhere. You believe you, 39, unworthy, so every silence feels like proof. But when you pause, ask, what is actually happening? You begin to see how often your stories are incorrect. You realize you've been reacting to ghosts, defending yourself from thoughts, not facts. This isn't about never feeling hurt. It's about knowing when the hurt is old and when it is real. When you see clearly, you don't deny emotion, you place it in the right context. You no longer let a passing moment become a lifelong identity. You feel disappointment, but you don't turn it into a belief that nothing ever works out. You experience tension, but you don't claim it as a personality trait. You stay grounded in the moment, not floating in the narrative. This practice also brings humility. You start to recognize how much you don't know, that most reactions are guesses, that most certainty is assumption. This softens your edges. You argue less. You listen more. You stop needing to prove your version of the story, because you understand that stories are always incomplete. You become more curious, more receptive, more anchored in the actual now. Seeing things as they are makes you more present with others too. You stop projecting motives. You stop needing constant validation. You listen without editing. You allow people to be who they are, without filtering them through who you expect them to be. This changes your relationships. It creates space for honesty. It invites less drama, less guessing, less emotional confusion. It also gives you back control over your energy, because once you stop feeding every emotional thought, you conserve attention. You're no longer tired from the weight of imagined meaning. You become more focused, more steady. Not because life stopped being complex, but because your mind stopped adding unnecessary layers. The practice of Yathabhuta brings calm not by changing what happens, but by changing how deeply you see it. You begin to live with emotional precision. You feel without exaggeration. You sense without distortion. You respond without dragging the past into the present. And this doesn't make you passive, it makes you wise. You take action from truth, not from habit. You speak from clarity, not from assumption. You connect from presence, not from need. This clarity simplifies life. It reduces confusion. It dissolves the noise that once seemed so loud. Each time you feel overwhelmed, you return to this question: what is actually happening? You breathe into the body. You observe the mind. You stay with the experience as it is. And in that presence, the story begins to fall apart. What's left is the moment. Simple, unfiltered, free. This is the strength of Yathabhuta. It does not fight the mind. It trains it. It refines awareness until awareness can rest in itself, until you no longer need certainty to feel safe, until you no longer need a story to know who you are. You see what is. You meet it fully. And in that meeting, you are no longer tangled. You are free not from emotion, but from the illusion built around it. You are wholly not because everything makes sense, but because you stopped needing it to. You live in reality, not the one you explain, but the one you can feel, touch, hear, and meet as it unfolds fresh, unfiltered, and enough. When you start seeing things clearly, without distortion, a new kind of awareness begins to take shape. You're no longer tangled in old stories. You begin to feel the present as it is. But sometimes, even with that clarity, something still feels blocked. You can't explain it. You're not caught in the past or projecting into the future, and yet there's still resistance. The mind pulls away from practice. The heart feels dull. You sit with good intentions, but can't seem to drop into presence. These are the moments when another layer of insight is needed, one that points directly to the underlying currents shaping your inner state. This is where the 5 hindrances come in. The 5 hindrances are not just obstacles to meditation. They are signals, emotional messengers, diagnostic tools for understanding what is happening beneath the surface. They reveal the conditions that are quietly blocking your awareness and making peace feel far away. By recognizing them clearly, you stop fighting yourself. You begin to see that your difficulty is not personal, it's patterned, and patterns can be worked with. The first hindrance is sensual desire. This isn't only about physical craving, it's about any emotional pull toward distraction, the longing for stimulation, comfort, escape. When this hindrance is active, your attention is scattered. Your mind latches onto what feels pleasant and runs after it. You may find yourself unable to stay with the breath, constantly planning or fantasizing. Underneath the surface, you may be avoiding discomfort or uncertainty. This craving doesn't always look intense. Sometimes it's subtle, like the urge to check your phone, seek approval, or replay pleasurable memories. The key is to recognize it without judgment, to pause and ask, what am I trying not to feel right now? What in me believes I need this in order to feel okay? The second hindrance is ill will. This appears not only as anger, but as irritation, impatience, and resentment. When this arises, you might notice a tightening in your chest, a sharpness in your thoughts, or a tendency to blame. This hindrance makes it hard to open. It keeps you locked in a defensive posture. Even when directed at yourself, it creates tension and self-rejection. Often, ill will points to unmet needs or boundaries that were crossed. Instead of suppressing it or acting on it, you learn to hold it. You inquire gently, what part of me is asking to be heard? What pain am I masking with judgment? The third hindrance is sloth and torpor. This is not just tiredness, it's heaviness of mind, a dullness, a fog, a sense of disengagement. You might feel sleepy when you sit to reflect, but it's not physical. Exhaustion needs emotional resistance. This hindrance can mask grief, avoidance, or a lack of meaning. It can also arise when you're unconsciously shutting down to protect yourself. Instead of fighting the drowsiness or forcing alertness, you ask, what am I disconnected from? Where has my energy gone? And why? Sometimes reconnecting with purpose or simply noticing this lethargy with clarity brings light back in. The fourth hindrance is restlessness and worry. It's a scattered, anxious energy, the inability to sit still. The racing mind that jumps from one thought to another. It often carries guilt, unfinished business, or fear of the unknown. When this is present, your emotional body may feel charged or unsettled. The breath feels shallow. Concentration slips away. Instead of judging the movement, you observe it. You ask, what am I unwilling to be with? What fear am I running from? Restlessness often arises when the present moment feels insufficient or unsafe. When you recognize it, you begin to make space for stillness by facing what you were trying to escape. The fifth hindrance is doubt. This one can be subtle but powerful. It questions the practice. It questions your progress. It questions your worth. It creates a fog of uncertainty that keeps you stuck. Doubt can mask fear of failure, fear of responsibility, or fear of change. It tells you that you don't know enough, haven't done enough, aren't ready. This voice sounds convincing, but it's not rooted in truth. When you see it as a hindrance, you stop believing it automatically. You ask, is this voice protecting me from something? What would happen if I moved forward anyway? These 5 hindrances are not enemies, they are mirrors. Each one points to an emotional knot that's asking to be untied. Instead of reacting or suppressing, you work with them. You learn their signals. You get curious. You allow them to teach you. Over time, they lose their control, not because they disappear, but because you see them clearly and don't get pulled in. Recognizing these hindrances in daily life helps you understand why presence sometimes feels out of reach. You might find that a conflict with someone isn't really about theme, it's rooted in desire for control or unresolved anger. You might realize your fatigue is not just about your schedulites, emotional avoidance. You begin to use every inner block as information. You stop pushing. You start listening. This listening creates clarity. You no longer move through life reacting to hidden emotional friction. You see what's there. You name it. You hold it with awareness. And because of that, it begins to shift. You stop needing to fight yourself. You stop needing to force clarity. You begin to trust the process of meeting each state with presence. This approach also brings compassion. When you see how the hindrances affect you, you recognize them in others too. You stop expecting everyone to be steady all the time. You see the craving behind someone's urgency. You see the doubt behind someone's silence. You see the worry behind someone's aggression. This doesn't make you naive, it makes you kinder. You stop taking everything personally. You begin to respond instead of react. The 5 hindrances are not blocks to avoid. They are doorways into deeper awareness. They show you where you're stuck and how to come back. You stop being confused by your moods. You start using them as guides. When you feel foggy, you look for sloth. When you feel edgy, you explore ill will. When you feel ungrounded, you examine restlessness. When nothing feels right, you check for doubt. When you can't focus, you explore craving. This process is not about diagnosing yourself with flaws. It's about developing skill in navigating your inner world. Emotional mastery doesn't mean you never feel heavy or distracted. It means you know how to work with what arises. You become less afraid of your mind. You become more familiar with your emotional landscape. Each hindrance teaches a different lesson. Sensual desire teaches the value of presence. Ill will teaches the necessity of compassion. Sloth teaches the power of wakefulness. Restlessness teaches the gift of stillness. Doubt teaches the strength of faith not in belief, but in your capacity to continue. These lessons are not abstract. They show up every day, every time you sit in silence, every time you turn inward. The more you learn to recognize these forces, the faster you return to balance. They lose their grip. You stop mistaking them for truth. You meet each one with clarity, and through that meeting, you find peace. Not because the mind is silent, but because your relationship with the noise has changed. Using the 5 hindrances as emotional diagnostics brings wisdom into places where confusion once ruled. It shows you where your practice lives right in the middle of craving, restlessness, doubt. You begin to see that what you once thought were problems are actually paths. Each hindrance is not a wall. It is a gate. And when you walk through it with awareness, what you find on the other side is not more struggle but freedom. One step, one breath, one clear moment at a time. Once you learn to recognize the 5 hindrances, not as flaws but as signals, you begin to relate to your own emotional states with more clarity and patience. You stop treating discomfort as failure and start using it as information. But understanding what blocks the mind is only half of the process. The next step is to create new patterns that replace those old tendencies, not just mentally, but biologically. This is where practice moves from insight into transformation. And one of the most powerful tools for this kind of rewiring is metta bhavanathe, cultivation of loving kindness. Metta is not a soft feeling or sentimental mood. It's a deliberate act of training the heart to respond with goodwill, regardless of how the world appears. It begins with intention and strengthens through repetition. Over time, it reshapes the nervous system. It helps the mind return to safety. It teaches the body what ease feels like. Metta changes the way you relate to yourself and others, not by force, but by reconditioning your default settings. Your brain, like the rest of the body, adapts to what it practices. If you rehearse self-criticism, your mind becomes quick to judge. If you stay in chronic fear, your system stays on alert. If you hold on to resentment, your stress response remains active. This becomes the baseline from which you operate. But with intention and repetition, those circuits can change. The emotional brain, particularly areas like the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, begins to respond differently over time. And metta is one of the most effective ways to guide that change. Metta bhavana follows a structure that begins with sending goodwill to yourself. This is often the most difficult step because many people carry internalized shame, disappointment, or self-doubt. At first, the phrases may feel empty or forced. But this is not about emotion, it's about direction. Each repetition of "May I be well, may I be safe, may I be peaceful" is like planting a seed. You don't evaluate it after the first day. You keep watering. As you continue to practice, those seeds begin to affect your baseline mood. The brain starts to create new associations. Instead of danger, it begins to register kindness. Instead of unworthiness, it begins to sense care. Even if it feels mechanical at first, the repetition lays down new tracks. Slowly, the heart opens, the body softens, and the mind becomes less reactive. From self, you extend metta to someone you love easily. This strengthens connection. It activates circuits related to empathy, oxytocin release, and social bonding. You are reinforcing your capacity for joy in the joy of others. Not only does this reduce emotional isolation, it also rebalances parts of the brain associated with reward and safety. Then you bring to mind someone neutral, a person you don't know well. This step broadens your sense of inclusion. It begins to erase the subtle walls the mind creates between us and them. You train yourself to care without personal benefit. The practice here teaches the mind that connection isn't based on familiarity, it's based on shared existence. The most transformative stage comes when you send metta to someone who is difficult. This step activates not only compassion but also resilience. It does not mean approving of harm. It means choosing not to reinforce hatred. Each time you offer goodwill to someone you struggle with, you're rewiring the emotional loops of resentment. The more you do this, the less reactive those patterns become. Neuroscience has shown that practices like loving kindness meditation increase activity in the left prefrontal cortex, an area associated with emotional regulation and positive states. It also reduces the density of gray matter in the amygdala, which plays a central role in fear and threat perception. Over time, this can lower your baseline level of stress, improve your ability to recover from setbacks, and make your emotional responses more balanced. But beyond structural change, metta also alters your habits of perception. You begin to see people differently. You no longer fixate on their flaws. You begin to notice their vulnerability, their humanity. This softens judgment. It helps you step out of your conditioned reactions and relate from a more grounded place. The practice becomes most effective when integrated into daily life. Instead of waiting for formal meditation, you bring metta into moments of tension. You respond to your own stress with kindness. You offer silent goodwill to a stranger. You catch the inner critic and meet it with compassion. Each of these moments creates a small shift, and over time, these small shifts build new emotional architecture. Metta also supports healing from emotional wounds. Often, past experiences of rejection or betrayal linger not just as memories, but as habitual responses. The nervous system learns to brace for hurt, even when there is no danger. Metta begins to create safety from within. It reminds the body what it feels like to be met with care. This internal safety becomes a foundation from which you can process, feel, and release what has been held for too long. The rewiring that occurs through loving kindness is not about pretending everything is fine. It's about creating enough emotional space to meet life as it is. Metta does not erase grief, anger, or fear, but it makes it safe to feel them. It gives the heart enough strength to hold what it once avoided. It increases tolerance for discomfort while deepening the ability to stay open. This openness also affects how you receive others. You no longer need everyone to behave a certain way in order to feel okay. You stop measuring people by their usefulness. You begin to relate without needing to control. This creates genuine connection, not because everyone changes, but because you change the lens through which you see them. When practiced consistently, metta becomes your emotional default. You become less reactive. You recover faster. You notice pain, but don't collapse into it. You feel disappointment, but don't let it harden your heart. The brain begins to expect safety instead of threat, and this expectation changes how you move through the world. You begin to live with less fear, not because nothing hurts, but because kindness becomes your baseline response. You stop needing to protect yourself from your own mind. Your inner voice becomes a friend, not a critic. This is emotional rewiring, not through suppression, but through compassion. Metta bhavana also strengthens attention. Because it requires focus, It trains the mind to stay with intention rather than drift into reactivity. You begin to notice when your mind moves toward judgment or avoidance, and you return, not to an idea, but to a practice, to a way of meeting yourself and others that builds resilience from the inside out. This resilience makes you more emotionally intelligent. You become sensitive without becoming overwhelmed. You develop empathy without burnout. You are able to stay present with suffering without needing to escape. Metta does not make you soft. It makes you stable. Kindness becomes strength. Compassion becomes clarity. There is also a physiological benefit. Metta practice lowers heart rate variability, improves immune function, and regulates blood pressure. The body becomes more relaxed, more balanced. It no longer lives in fight or flight. It begins to trust that you will meet it with care. Over time, metta becomes more than a practice. It becomes a way of living, a way of thinking, a way of seeing. It moves from your cushion into your relationships, your decisions, your silence. It becomes how you speak, how you rest, how you move through difficulty. The practice does not require belief, it only requires willingness. Willingness to return again and again, even when you feel nothing, even when the words feel mechanical. Because every return is a signal to the nervous system. We are safe, we are seen, we are loved. This signal reshapes everything, not just how you feel, but how you live, not just how you relate to others, but how you exist within yourself. And slowly, what once felt like effort becomes your nature. What once needed to be practiced becomes instinct. What once felt out of reach becomes the ground you walk on. That is the power of metta bhavana, not a temporary mood, but a permanent shift, a rewiring of the sift, emotional circuits, a transformation of the nervous system, a return to what the heart always knew but forgot. Kindness is not a reward. It is a path, a medicine, a way home. As loving kindness begins to reset the emotional foundation, you start to notice a surprising change in your nervous system. Not everything feels like a threat. You don't respond to discomfort with urgency. You begin to trust that presence is enough. But even as the heart softens, a deep layer of cultural conditioning often remains, the pressure to constantly be doing. It hides beneath the surface of daily life, showing up as guilt during rest, anxiety during stillness, and a constant need to justify your existence through output. This pressure is not just external, it becomes internalized as a belief that being busy equals being worthy. To heal this pattern, you don't need more activity, you need space. This is where the path leads to sacred idleness. In Zen, doing nothing is not laziness. It is presence without agenda. It is a return to being without the need to become. This kind of idleness is medicine for a system trained to equate effort with value. When you are always moving, always striving, always managing tasks and goals, you lose contact with what is already complete. Idleness offers no badge of honor. It offers a mirror, a space where nothing needs to happen and everything becomes visible. Intentional idleness is not just the absence of productivity, it is the fullness of presence. You are not checking out, you are checking in. You are not distracted, you are deeply aware. You stop chasing the next moment and start inhabiting the one you're in. This shift creates space for the nervous system to recalibrate. It teaches the body what it means to rest without collapse and to pause without guilt. Much of emotional exhaustion comes not from doing too much, but from doing without pause. When Every moment is filled, there is no time to integrate. Experiences pile up, thoughts spin, emotions backlog. Sacred idleness allows the system to process in real time. When you sit without a plan, without stimulation, you start to feel what has been waiting. Unfelt tension begins to surface, not to overwhelm, but to be seen. This kind of stillness is often uncomfortable at first. The mind resists. It tells you there's something else to fix, to clean, to finish. It says rest is earned, not allowed. But if you stay, if you do nothing long enough, the noise starts to settle. Beneath the agitation is a silence that holds everything. This is not emptiness in a negative sense. It is the kind of emptiness that reveals spaciousness, a state where nothing is missing because nothing is being pursued. In Zen, this is sometimes referred to as wu-effortless action. It is the understanding that life unfolds without being forced. When you align with this, your doing arises from stillness rather than stress. You respond to life instead of chasing it. You stop trying to make everything happen and start trusting what is already unfolding. Sacred idleness is especially important for emotional healing. When you stop filling every gap, emotions that have been pushed aside have room to breathe. You begin to feel subtle layer-souled grief, quiet joy, soft longing. These are the parts of you that don't shout. They wait, and they need stillness to speak. Letting yourself do nothing is also an act of self-respect. It affirms that you do not need to perform for your own worth, that you are not here to be consumed by goals, that your value is not measured by how much you produce, achieve, or control. This understanding doesn't stop you from working, it changes the energy behind your work. It brings clarity to your action and balance to your rhythm. Restoring your relationship with stillness also changes how you experience time. Without constant productivity, time stops feeling like something to conquer. It becomes space to inhabit. You feel less rushed, less pulled. The hours expand, presence returns. You are no longer living from the next task, you are living from attention. In sacred idleness, creativity also begins to flow differently. When the mind is not pressured, it opens. New insights arise. Solutions come without being hunted. Emotional clarity appears because the noise has quieted. This is not the creativity of striving, it is the creativity of allowing. When there is no agenda, something deeper begins to move. This practice also strengthens emotional regulation. When you train yourself to pause without distraction, you develop tolerance for stillness. You become less reactive, less dependent on external validation. You stop reaching for noise to avoid feeling. You let emotions rise and pass in silence. And in that silence, you learn to trust your capacity to hold whatever comes. Over time, idleness becomes a kind of sanctuary. You don't need a reason to rest. You don't wait until burnout. You weave stillness into your life as nourishment. A quiet walk, a moment staring out the window, a few minutes of sitting without doing anything. These pauses become anchors. They return you to yourself. They remind you that peace is not a reward, it is a return. This shift in rhythm also affects your relationships. When you no longer carry the tension of constant doing, you show up with more presence. You listen without rushing. You speak without needing to fill space. You become more available, not because you are doing more, but because you are more here. Letting go of the productivity script is not easy. It often means confronting internal beliefs. Beliefs that say rest is weakness, that silence is waste, that idleness is selfish. But those beliefs are not truth, they are conditioning, and they can be unlearned. One moment of stillness at a time. In sacred idleness, you begin to recover your natural rhythm. You feel the ebb and flow of energy. You respond with care. You rest when rest is needed. You act when action is natural. You no longer push from fear. You move from presence. This creates not only emotional balance but also physical vitality. The body thrives when it is no longer forced to operate in overdrive. Stillness also reveals what is real. Without constant activity, illusions lose their grip. You see more clearly what matters, what is yours to carry, and what can be put down. You stop being pulled by urgency. You start being guided by truth. In Zen, there is no separation between rest and wisdom. Doing nothing is not an escape. It is a practice, a way to return to the center, a way to meet life with honesty, a way to dissolve the layers of noise and come back to what is essential. This practice doesn't require hours. It begins in moments, a quiet breath between tasks, a pause before responding, a few minutes of simply sitting with the sky. These small shifts change everything. They recalibrate your nervous system. They return you to calm. They teach you that being is not a break from doing. It is the foundation of it. Sacred idleness is not passive. It is awake. It is aware. It is the stillness that makes clear seeing possible. The rest that makes right action sustainable. The silence that makes true speech arise. In choosing to pause, you choose to live in alignment, not with culture, not with pressure, but with your own being. And that being does not need to earn rest. It is worthy because it exists. It is whole because it is here. In silence, in stillness, in the medicine of nothing. You've just traveled through over 3 hours of timeless Buddhist wisdom, gently, layer by layer, stripping away the confusion, the noise, and the heaviness you've been carrying. Together, we've explored silence as medicine, suffering as transformation, identity as illusion, thoughts as energy, presence as healing, and stillness as power. You've learned how to meet pain with compassion, how to drop the emotional stories that hold you hostage, how to reset your mind with loving kindness, and how to finally, truly let go. Not by escaping life, but by entering it more fully. Not by chasing peace, but by remembering it's already here. This wasn't just a lesson, it was a reset, a return. And if even one insight helped your heart feel lighter, your mind feel clearer, or your breath feel softer, then you've already begun. Now it's your turn to speak. Leave a comment below with one teaching that stayed with you. A moment that opened something, a shift you felt. Let your words be part of someone else's reset. And if you found peace here, needn't keep it to yourself. Click subscribe and tap the bell icon so this kind of clarity follows you into the days ahead. Let's keep learning, let's keep practicing, and above all, let's keep returning to what's real. See you in the next teaching. Until then, breathe deeply, live gently, and let go.